Welcome to the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Stakeholder Workshop. Today's event is brought to you by the U.S. Department of Energy and the Bureau of Ocean Management. I am Whitney Bell, and I will be your host today. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items. This WebEx meeting is being recorded and may be used by the U.S. Department of Energy. If you do not wish to have your voice recorded, please do not speak during the call. If you do not wish to have your image recorded, please turn off your camera or participate by phone. If you speak during the call or use a video connection, you are providing consent to recording and use of your voice or image. All participants are in listen-only mode. If you need to view the live captioning, please refer to the link that will appear in the chat now. We are taking questions throughout today's event. You may submit them using the chat function and select Send to Host. Additionally, if you have any technical issues or questions, you may type them in the chat box and select Send to Host for assistance. The purpose of today's meeting is to ask for your input regarding the Atlantic offshore wind transmission topics. To that end, it would be most helpful to us if, based on your personal experience, you provide us with your individual advice, information, or facts regarding this topic. The objective of this session is to not obtain any group position or consensus. Rather, the Department of Energy and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management are seeking as many recommendations as possible from all individuals at this meeting. To use our limited time most effectively, please refrain from passing judgment on another participant's recommendations or advice, and instead concentrate on your individual experiences. Finally, a copy of today's presentation will be posted on the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission webpage by Friday. The recording of today's workshop will be available on that same page in about 2 weeks. We're excited to kick off today's workshop with a series of keynote remarks. While they were not able to join us live, they did provide recorded remarks for us to share with you today. The U.S. Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, is going to kick us off today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Stakeholder Workshop. I do know how much work has gone into running this series, so I want to start with a big thank you to my friend, Secretary Holland, and of course to our colleagues at the Interior Department and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management for their incredible partnership over the past year. I also know these discussions have actually borne a lot of fruit, and that is thanks to all of you. You are the planners, the policymakers, and the planet lovers who've engaged with us throughout this process. And together, we've got our sight set on one of the Biden administration's most ambitious clean energy goals, deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. We know what a tremendous opportunity that number represents. The opportunity to power 10 million homes with clean electricity, the opportunity to create tens of thousands of good-paying American jobs, to create gusts of growth for local economies, and certainly a better health outcome for local communities. And that is why the president invested big in offshore wind through his clean energy laws. The Inflation Reduction Act, of course, includes tax credits that offer real certainty for investors and developers of offshore wind projects, which we hope to extend to transmission developers as well. The Inflation Reduction Act creates big incentives to build up supply chain manufacturing here in the U.S., and it makes those projects even more lucrative if they source American-made materials and if they pay their workers a prevailing wage, and even more incentives if they build in priority communities like those that have suffered most from the fossil fuel economy, or those that fear from being left behind as we pivot away from it. And critically, the IRA funds offshore wind transmission planning, which really brings me to why these workshops have been so important. To be blunt, our 2030 goal depends on our ability to connect new projects to the grid, and as you know, that is not exactly easy. Offshore wind transmission development is a particularly complicated dance, and as you know, it involves so many different jurisdictions and ecosystems and communities, but by working together, I think we're figuring out how to do it quickly, responsibly, and sustainably. Today, DOE and BOEM are very excited to share some interim results from our Atlantic offshore wind transmission study. and an initial look at our recommended action plan. This is actually the most comprehensive look so far at how we can spin fresh ocean air into clean, reliable power along the Atlantic coast from South Carolina to Maine. These recommendations cover everything from policy suggestions to technical requirements to potential sites and transmission paths, and they're informed by our countless conversations with tribal nations and states, regional grid operators, industry, researchers, and more over the past 2 years. We can't wait to show you what we've got today and to incorporate your feedback before we finalize the action plan later this spring. And from there, the real work of implementation begins. And these dialogues that you've started here only become more important because moving at the scale and speed that we need is going to require even greater coordination, particularly, as you know, among states and transmission planners. In fact, spoiler alert, one of our most critical recommendations today is that all the states and all the transmission planners should really team up and start working together as collaboratives. So everyone's coordinating from the get-go. Of course, the Biden administration, we are here to be your partner every step of the way. And we're eager to take the lessons that we learn with us out west as we launch our next transmission study convening series along the Pacific. So remember, when the winds of change blow, some build walls, others build wind turbines. So let's be turbine builders together for our planet and for our people. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And now it's a pleasure to introduce my friend, my colleague, Secretary Holland.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to send greetings to all of you participating in the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Stakeholder Workshop. Today's workshop concludes the convening series that Secretary Granholm and I kicked off last May. I want to send a huge thank you to the employees across DOI and DOE who work so hard to make these workshops possible. I especially want to thank our staff at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management for their commitment to making this effort a success. I know that several of our federal partners joined throughout the series. Their participation is a testament to President Biden's all-of-government approach to addressing the climate crisis with the opportunities that clean energy provides. During the Vineyard Wind groundbreaking we held over a year ago, our team stood where the very first cable will connect one of the nation's first commercial-scale offshore wind facilities to the mainland and eventually to the U.S. power grid. I remember being in awe of how significant that moment was and how transformational our administration's clean energy efforts will be for current and future generations. When we started this workshop series, we knew that there were frustrations with the state of energy transmission. We know, as do you, that we can't ensure families and businesses have access to clean energy without expansive energy transmission infrastructure. We must bring all this new power to shore in a thoughtful, responsible way. That's why we convened this workshop series. We wanted to create opportunities to help identify and solve the critical challenges facing offshore wind transmission. Issues like planning and development, siting and permitting, and forming fruitful partnerships. And we want to do it in collaboration with tribal nations, ocean users, communities, and stakeholders. And now, 9 workshops and nearly a year later, I think we've taken important steps forward in this essential process. These workshops have helped us better understand transmission-related challenges. Most importantly, they've helped us identify potential solutions. The feedback we've received from the convening workshops are helping inform our recommendations for offshore wind transmission development and for planning and permitting policy. Collaboration between agencies, tribal nations, states, regional transmission operators, developers, utilities, labor unions, and ocean users will be our guide as we map out what success looks like and seek to make opportunities available to all communities. I know that by coming together, we can tackle these challenges and ensure we are collectively meeting transmission needs and objectives in a safe and responsible way. Our clean energy future is here. We are well on our way to achieving the administration's goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030 and 15 gigawatts of floating wind capacity by 2035. The turning point in our nation's energy transition requires us to think big if we want to meaningfully address the climate crisis head-on. To do this, we must unleash an era of clean, reliable energy that serves every household in America. Holding the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Convening Series is one more milestone in our journey to our clean energy future. Thank you so much for your commitment to ensuring thoughtful, responsible, and innovative offshore wind transmission planning. I'm honored to have joined you and the other leaders here today, and I'm so excited to continue building momentum for our clean energy future. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear recorded remarks from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, representing Rhode Island.
Hello, everyone. I'm Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. It's great to join you for the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Public Workshop. I'd like to start by thanking the teams at the U.S. Department of Energy and the U.S. Department of Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management for bringing us together to discuss the future of offshore wind transmission and for their steadfast leadership on this important topic. Thanks are also due to the industry leaders and stakeholders here with us today. You're here because you share in our commitment to the success of the U.S. offshore wind industry and what it means in our fight against the climate crisis. It also allows us to boost an emerging industry and create well-paying jobs up and down the Atlantic. Today, you'll have an opportunity to provide input on the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Study results, the first federal study of its kind. Collectively, these findings demonstrate comprehensive and data-driven discussions with stakeholders and a commitment to developing sustainable and transmissible solutions for the offshore wind industry. The feedback provided today will help the Biden administration build out its plan for deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and set a framework for the future of offshore wind transmission development in the U.S. We are already making progress. We have half a dozen offshore wind farms aiming to come online in the next 2 years. But the path forward, I know, is not without obstacles. Indeed, the obstacles are real and significant, and I hear you about that. We're going to need to address some hefty challenges like permitting, siting, interconnection capacity, and cost allocation. We're going to need collaboration locally, regionally, and interregionally. These challenges have bedeviled us onshore. We know we cannot afford to let the same happen offshore. But with the help and expertise and cooperation of everyone here with us today, I'm confident that together we can tackle these challenges and bring offshore wind online in the most effective and efficient way possible. In 2016, when Rhode Island became home to America's first offshore wind farm, some had said it couldn't be done. But we did it. In fact, Rhode Island's small size positioned us to convene and implement efficiently, troubleshoot as needed, and ultimately deliver. We created a framework of what can be done and replicated and scaled in other coastal states across the country. It marked a significant step forward in offshore wind and demonstrated the potential of what's to come as the industry continues to grow. That's why this study is so important. It will help us enable transmission solutions for large-scale offshore wind deployment and enhanced grid reliability and resilience. Most importantly, it presents an opportunity for us to get this right and deliver those solutions to other coastal states that will follow the Atlantic's lead. Again, thank you all for your leadership in this space. I look forward to seeing the product of today's conversations and to continuing to support this effort together.
We also have remarks from Senator Ed Markey, representing Massachusetts.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Ed Markey, and I'm so happy to join you here today for the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Workshop and to highlight the importance of expanding transmission and the opportunities that are blowing in the wind, the same wind that blew the Pilgrims to Massachusetts. There's no doubt that offshore wind is a booming market. There has been a gale force growth, nearly 45,000 megawatts of state offshore wind targets, a growing number of leases on the east and west coast, and an increasing number of projects planned for the next 10 years. So that's why I'm just so glad that President Biden electrified our new offshore wind target for the United States, setting a goal of deploying 30,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 15,000 megawatts of floating offshore wind by 2035. We will need to turbo or turbine charge our offshore wind deployment if we are to confront the climate crisis and prevent our worst case climate scenarios. We're already seeing the devastation of climate fuel disasters and without zero carbon generation. And that damage is only a preview of coming attractions, or more accurately, atrocities that will be committed in the name of fossil fuels. But the tides, they are a-changing. Our country is getting closer to a future powered by the sun and wind, both onshore and offshore. The future. But without building out transmission, we will not be able to access the benefits of a clean energy future. What we need now is to deliver the infrastructure that is going to deliver renewable energy to the people where they live. We need to literally bring power to the people. It's not just a slogan from the 60s. It's about a revolution in the 21st century. And I see it every day in Massachusetts, where our residents and businesses are clamoring for renewable energy, and our region is primed to lead the offshore wind revolution. This must be the moment when we flip the switch for renewable energy in Massachusetts, in New England, and all across our nation. We must all work together to create an energy ecosystem that puts renewable energy, including offshore wind, on the grid once and for all and permanently. It is the future. And as we get there, we must ensure that this future is built in America by American workers. Thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, the United States will couple clean energy production and clean energy reliability with historic investments in American clean energy manufacturing and transmission deployment. We have to put the whole package together. And the IRA includes $30 billion for onshoring clean energy manufacturing in the United States across the full supply chain. That includes my Offshore Wind American Manufacturing Act that was built into the IRA, which will provide billions in manufacturing tax credits for offshore wind technology and vessels that are made in America. These manufacturing incentives will lower the burden of energy costs on American families and increase our energy security, ensuring that the transition to a clean economy creates millions of American clean manufacturing jobs. Wind in the United States, technologies made in the United States, that's what the future is, powering American-made clean technologies. And coupled with $2 billion to provide loans for transmission project development and more than $750 million for grants to site offshore and onshore transmission lines, our clean energy future is within reach. It's no longer something that's science fiction of the future. Because right now, instead of a renewable energy superhighway for the modern era, our grid is a 2-lane road that would be recognizable to Henry Ford or to Thomas Alva Edison. We still have a long road ahead, but today, let's take a moment to celebrate the preliminary findings being unveiled by this workshop, this discussion, these findings, all of you attending today. This will bring greatness to our grid and transform our transmission. Thank you all for your efforts and for having me with you today. Let's fill our sails, put the wind at the back of American industry, reduce greenhouse gases, create hundreds of thousands and millions of new jobs, and do so saying made in the USA. Thank you all for everything that you are doing to realize that vision of a better future.
Our final set of recorded remarks comes from Congresswoman Deborah Ross, representing North Carolina's 2nd District.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Secretary Granholm and Director Klein for having me and hosting today's joint workshop on Atlantic offshore wind transmission. And thank you to all of our participants for joining this discussion about the exciting future that lies ahead for the Atlantic offshore wind industry. I have the privilege of representing North Carolina, a state that is now poised to assume national and international leadership in the field of offshore wind development. North Carolina is an ideal state for offshore wind development, and other states along the Atlantic coast are in a similar position. The same strong, consistent winds that the Wright brothers used to become the first in flight can now be harnessed to power millions of homes and businesses and create tens of thousands of jobs, spurring billions in economic development. It took years to get us to this point, and Atlantic coast states would not be in this position without serious effort and coordination between our federal agencies, state governments, and the private sector, and of course, many of my colleagues in Congress. As we all know, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law last August, as well as my provision to reopen large swaths of the Atlantic to offshore wind leasing. Importantly, this landmark legislation also appropriated $100 million for planning, modeling, and analysis for offshore wind energy transmission, among other provisions for clean energy transmission. Leasing for offshore wind projects is well underway, and we have dozens of projects in the pipeline here in the United States. The Carolina Long Bay lease sale in May of last year awarded 2 more leases right off the North Carolina coast. And BOEM is in the process of reviewing 8 draft wind energy areas in the central Atlantic. But as we look to meet our federal and state goals for offshore wind energy deployment, we need to keep a steady focus on the importance of transmission solutions. The Atlantic coastline is incredibly diverse. Bringing power ashore on the Outer Banks is a lot different from bringing power ashore in the New York fight. Thankfully, DOE and BOEM are working hard, and they're working hand in hand to tackle transmission challenges and find solutions. Transmission is what will enable offshore wind deployment, increase energy reliability, reduce cost to ratepayers, reduce environmental impacts, and ensure our clean energy future. According to a recent report from the Brattle Group, a collaborative transmission planning process could include at least $20 billion in transmitted-related costs savings, 60 to 70% fewer shore crossings and necessary onshore transmission upgrades, approximately 2,000 fewer miles of marine transmission cable installations disturbing the seabed, and more competitive procurement options that will increase consumer savings, enhance reliability and grid resilience, and make more timely investment in the local clean energy economy. We must act now on transmission solutions. The Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Study from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is a major step in the right direction. I want to thank the Department of Energy and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management for your important work, and it has been so collaborative. I stand ready to work hand in hand with our agencies and my colleagues in Congress to act on solutions for this critical component of the offshore wind development in the United States. Thank you again for having me today and joining me to celebrate all that we've accomplished so far and all that we can achieve together in the future. All of you are helping to create a cleaner, more prosperous future for generations of Americans to come. Thank you so much.
Now I would like to introduce Commissioner Allison Clements from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. She'll be giving you live remarks today. Commissioner Clements, I'll go ahead and turn this over to you.
There's a short window of opportunity to position the offshore wind industry and therefore the country for the success in capturing the benefits that Representative Ross and Senator Markey were just speaking about. What a prospect we have. But as Secretary Granholm emphasized, it hinges on coordination to efficiently develop both the on and offshore grids required to facilitate success. That coordination must be between states and across states and regions, especially, as the Secretary mentioned, between states and the relevant grid operators. States are moving forward toward their own energy goals. And it's exciting to see industry take strides towards the commercial operation of significant projects. But projects are being developed under the status quo grid interconnection process, which connects individual projects via radial transmission lines that may not be optimally sized or located at the most efficient points of interconnection. More holistic planning at the regional and interregional levels offers the potential for more efficient and therefore more affordable and environmentally sensitive infrastructure development. So for example, strategically designed onshore transmission upgrades could provide for a lower total cost of interconnection for a series of offshore projects, with each point of interconnection optimized to efficiently facilitate states' broader goals. The long-term nature of offshore wind generation and transmission planning makes it important to get it right from the start, cost-effectively, inclusively, and sustainably. And we have that opportunity. But to make it work, that collaboration needs to start now. The Department of Energy and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's engagement that culminates in today's final workshop, along with the support of our national labs, has really set the stage for exactly the sort of collaborative effort we need. I want to commend the staff who are leading the stakeholder effort and the study effort at both agencies for your critical leadership. Your effort has been comprehensive and it's been accessible and timely. This work makes possible achieving the massive challenge of developing an optimized offshore grid, getting it done right and getting it done quickly. At FERC, my staff and the broader commission are working hard on many related initiatives, including what many of you know as our pending Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on Regional Transmission Planning and Interconnection, as well as our inquiry into establishing interregional transfer capability and cost allocation, all of those details of transmission system planning and development. It's my hope that action by the Commission on these initiatives will serve as an important piece of the puzzle we must solve towards a more efficient transmission system. But in the meantime, it's worth reminding you all that you don't need to wait for FERC. Efforts towards collaborating now across regional actors, states, utilities, and all stakeholders will not go to waste. New England states are already starting to collaborate on offshore transmission issues. Continued and deepened collaboration can jumpstart exactly the sort of response to FERC's proposals that I'm hoping to see. That you're all here today is an encouraging step in that respect. Thank you for your work. It really is a stakeholder process that has been effective and hopefully the report provides actionable next steps. And that's, I know, hard to do in such a big setting and a large set of stakeholders like this one. I really look forward to hearing what comes of today's stakeholder input and reading the final report upon its release. So good luck and thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Clements. Now let's move on to our first presentation. Please join me in welcoming Jocelyn Brown-Sarcino, offshore wind lead at DOE, for her presentation on transmission development on the path to 30 gigawatts and beyond. Jocelyn, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. And good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all very much for taking the time to join us today. I'm going to be spending just a couple minutes talking about both the rationale for the effort that we're going to be talking about today, the roots of this effort, how it fits within the broader work that's necessary in order to advance just and sustainable offshore wind in the United States, and then also how the action plan that you're going to be hearing about today nests within a broader set of resources that we have to advance transmission development and R&D in the United States more broadly. And, as we've heard from our fellow speakers, I think collectively we're here today because we recognize how important transmission development is to the success of offshore wind development in the United States. But also how important critical deliberate planning for transmission is, including accounting for more than the movement of electrons, but of course accounting for ocean co-use, marine environments, indigenous knowledge, and much more. And that's really the approach that the Departments of Energy and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management took to developing this action plan and the analysis that we're going to be discussing today. And it's a really key part of why your involvement, feedback, engagement, and collaboration is so critical today and beyond. So with that, we very much look forward to your input today and working with you moving forward. So to begin, there's really no secret, I think, to folks who are joining us today that we have a large potential offshore wind resource in the United States that we've really just begun to tap. Our latest analysis shows that we've got in the United States over 4 terawatts of technical offshore wind potential in the United States. And capturing even a small portion of that could power tens of millions of American homes and businesses with clean and reliable energy. And that development is really critical to regional decarbonization along many of our coasts. And so it was really in light of that in March of 2022, the Departments of Energy, Interior, and Commerce came together to announce the joint deployment goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, but also at the same time articulating that meeting that goal could help unlock a path of more than 110 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. And the hope is that meeting this goal catalyzes the growth of a new industry. It revitalizes our nation's waterfronts, provides good paying jobs, and helps address the climate emergency. And this foundational step, combined, of course, with the efforts of many, including notable leadership from states along both our coasts, or both the East and West Coast and beyond, has really brought us to this exciting point of immense opportunity for offshore wind. And yet, there is much more work to be done, of course, to move us from our current installed capacity of 42 megawatts of offshore wind to realizing our 2030 goal and really treating that goal as a stepping stone on a path to larger future development of offshore wind in the United States beyond 2030. And as we were setting our 30 gigawatt target with an eye towards a path to 110 gigawatts, we worked to really try to identify the strategic needs and challenges to meeting those goals. And we laid that out in a national strategies report that we published last year. And so I want to take just a minute to talk about how the work that we're doing in transmission fits within kind of the broader need space that we identified. And that includes a continued importance on supporting work to reduce the cost of energy for offshore wind, the work that we need to do to continue to expand deployment while doing so in ways that protect habitats and ocean co-use, engages communities, tribal nations, and ocean co-users, both in project siting and then important to this conversation and transmission development. The work that we need to do to support the development of a robust domestic offshore wind supply chain, and that includes a transmission supply chain. And then, of course, relevant to our gathering today, the work that we need to do to resolve transmission challenges, both in areas adjacent to our coastlines, and assure that power is brought on shore in a cost-effective and equitable manner. And of course, we know that transmission, including those onshore upgrades, developing shared transmission for offshore wind, and upgrading points of interconnection is going to be really critical as we look towards our offshore wind goals. And so it was really in light of that the Department of Energy and the Department of Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management decided to kick off the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Initiative almost 2 years ago now. And as many of you are undoubtedly aware, and many of you have provided input along the way, this effort includes both the 2-year study that you've heard referenced today, as well as the series of convening conversations that have helped identify planning, policy, and permitting changes needed to enable growth in a responsible manner. And our hope is that this initiative really helps chart a path forward for how we can build out transmission in the Atlantic. But I also want to take a minute just to note that alongside the planning efforts in the action plan that you're going to be hearing about today, DOE has several other tools that we're bringing to bear to address national transmission challenges. At the beginning of 2022, DOE launched a Building a Better Grid initiative to catalyze transmission development and investment in the distribution system. And as part of that program, last November, the U.S. Department of Energy announced $13 billion in funding for new financing opportunities for the expansion and modernization of the nation's electrical grid. And I also want to note that we're working to address R&D needs with respect to offshore wind transmission development as well, with an eye to ensuring that we're enabling long-distance transmission solutions. So this last December, for example, the Department of Energy's wind program released a funding opportunity with funds from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that includes $10 million in funding for high-voltage direct current standards development, controls work, and workforce development. And then also through the Inflation Reduction Act, DOE's loan program has additional loan authority and funding available for a wide range of applications for the offshore wind sector, including transmission projects. And then finally, we're really trying to work to support R&D that looks at complementary uses of offshore wind, such as the generation of clean fuels using offshore wind energy. And then finally, just a quick note before I turn the microphone back over. While today's efforts or today's workshop is really pertaining to the work that we've done on transmission efforts along the Atlantic coast, as we move forward, we're really looking to make this work national in scope. And as you heard from Secretary Granholm, as part of our interagency floating offshore wind shot, the U.S. Department of Energy is expanding our transmission analysis efforts to the West Coast with a recently announced West Coast focused regional transmission analysis. So for those of you working on the West Coast as well, we're looking forward to collaborating with you there in the future. And so in closing, I want to thank you all for being here today. As you've heard from others so far, we're acutely aware that transmission development is challenging, but we're equally aware that it will be critical as we work to develop carbon-free energy systems. And we're hoping that this action plan will help provide a roadmap for how we could build offshore wind transmission in the Atlantic. But of course, much more is needed to turn an action plan into reality, including the sorts of collaborations that you've heard about so clearly from the speakers who spoke before me today. And so your input is really critical today, and your continued feedback will be vital as we expand our efforts and as we work to turn this action plan into action. So thanks again, and I'm looking forward to your input over the course of the session today.
Thank you, Jocelyn, for framing the Atlantic offshore wind transmission work into the larger offshore wind strategy. I think that's really important. I would now like to introduce Greg Brinkman, engineer with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, to provide an update on the Atlantic offshore wind transmission study. We will have some time for Q&A with Greg after his presentation, so please submit your questions using the chat box, select Send to Host, and we can bring those up in a little bit. Greg, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the introduction. I'm Greg Brinkman, and I'm here today representing a larger team from the National Renewable Energy Lab and the Pacific Northwest National Lab. For some background, at the end of 2021, the Department of Energy requested that our two national laboratories perform a study to help inform stakeholder questions around interregional transmission in the Atlantic from Maine through South Carolina. This grew out of regional and interregional planning conversations and proposals, including New York's mesh-ready concept and related concepts that now exist in New Jersey and New England. We're currently about 2/3 of the way done with the study, aiming to complete it before the end of this year, but we have some interesting analysis and maps that we wanted to share with you today to help inform this conversation and also to let everyone know what we're studying. We have a technical review committee made up of stakeholders from many of the organizations and people that are on the call here today. They're helping us review all of our assumptions and methods throughout the study, and we really want to thank all these people for their time, efforts, and expertise. The goal of the study really is looking to quantify some of the impacts of several different topologies of the Atlantic offshore transmission system, focusing on a scenario with 85 gigawatts of offshore wind in the Atlantic by the year 2050 and a low-carbon onshore grid. We're specifically aiming to quantify some of the economic, reliability, and resilience impacts of these topologies and pathways. Offshore wind development can provide a unique opportunity to potentially add transmission capacity within or between regions by interconnecting offshore platforms. We are designing several different topologies for further study. Today, we're going to focus on what we're calling our radial and interregional topologies in the list here at the bottom of this slide. Actually, if you could go back, please, Whitney. Thank you. The radial topology represents a future where each project is at least a gigawatt, significant size projects, and has a single cable connecting offshore platform to onshore point of interconnection, also known as a POI. And these cable paths are routed around geospatial exclusions to relatively good onshore POIs. The interregional topology is specifically designed to take advantage of opportunities to connect diverse regions with interlinks in the offshore network, or interlinks between the offshore platforms. We will also study a within-region or intra-regional interlink topology, which is more consistent with existing state and regional plans, and a backbone topology, which will be larger and longer than the interregional build. If you could go to the next slide, please, Whitney. Thank you. This map shows the radial topology we are currently studying. It was designed by balancing three main elements. One is the per megawatt hour cost or levelized cost of electricity of the wind based on the wind resource, depth, and other factors. Two is the electrical favorability of potential points of interconnection, specifically focusing on POIs identified by stakeholders in previous studies and discussions. Our team also identified a few other possibilities through power flow modeling and other identification. Cable distances between, the third thing is cable distances between the wind and the point of interconnection, subject to path routes that avoid exclusion zones. These exclusion zones represent environmental or other siting challenges to developing transmission cables under the seabed, including environmental, co-use, military and danger zones, and Army Corps of Engineer exclusions. The existing lease areas are assumed to be completely developed with additional development outside those areas. This radial topology will be used as the basis for all of the other topologies that we're studying. In other words, the export cables and wind generation that's developed in this topology is identical in all the other topologies. It's just the offshore platforms which provide these potential opportunities for interlinking to develop transmission capacities between points of interconnection and potentially increase the utilization of the offshore wind. We developed the interregional topology based on this radial topology by looking for potential opportunities where we could connect congested regions and reduce the cost of producing electricity throughout the grid. We find these opportunities by simulating the grid operations and prices using this radial topology and using that information to select the best offshore platforms to interlink. I'll show you some of this information in a moment. We really looked for offshore substations that are connected to POIs with significant price differences in order to provide the most congestion mitigation value to the grid And we also look to minimize the cable distances of these interlinks as much as possible. We're in the process of developing an intra-regional or within-region topology and the larger backbone topology. We'll then study all of these topologies in more detail to understand the economics, reliability, and resilience impacts using production cost models, resource adequacy models, cost analyses, and steady state and dynamic power flow and reliability modeling. Whitney, if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. This slide visualizes the price differences that we saw between potential onshore points of interconnection from our one-year simulation for the year 2050 in a low-carbon scenario. Each point on this matrix shows the price diversity between those points of interconnection, with the POIs ordered from northernmost to southernmost, from top to bottom, and also northernmost to southernmost from left to right in the table. The darker green colors indicate larger or more price diversity and more potential value to interlinking. Next slide, please. On this slide, the red squares show the POI interconnections between POIs in the same region, starting with the northernmost sites in ISO New England at the top left, all the way down to sites in CERC at the bottom right. Note that we are still refining our within-region congestion modeling, and so these values within the red squares have more significant uncertainty. Within each region, we do see some price diversity, typically when connecting points of interconnection that are relatively far apart. Also note that reliability and resilience value, such as continuing power flows during an export cable outage, would exist even between points of interconnection that are within the same region and have no price diversity. The thing that really stands out on this chart is the dark green colors outside of these red boxes, which represent the price differences between POIs in different regions. Next slide, please. So these red boxes represent some of the potential interregional connections that we selected to represent in the interregional topology. These represent some of the biggest potential value connections, and we developed the connections to attempt to make the interregional transmission expansion without extremely long cable runs, which we'll see here on the next slide. So first, I just want to clarify that we're building these topologies for studying and studies and analysis of the value of the interregional transmission and the different types of topologies that we'll be studying. And the goal of this is not to suggest precise future builds or points of interconnection. And I'll mention this a few times throughout the presentation. On the left, we have the radial topology that we saw earlier. On the right, we see the resulting network of offshore connections for the interregional topology. Note that the non-interlinked export cables are removed from this image, so you're just looking in the right side at the interlinked networks. The export cables in this scenario, in this topology, are all identical to the radial topology on the left. In this interregional example, these would be multi-terminal high voltage DC or HVDC networks using a bipole 525 kV technology with approximately 2 gigawatts or 2,000 megawatts of maximum power flow per cable or connection. In the north here, we have 3 different independent multi-terminal networks that connect ISO New England with New York ISO and PJM in that order. These are 6-terminal networks with 1 POI in each of the 3 regions and 1 platform offshore directly connected to each of these POIs, with the platforms being interlinked in the ocean. And so we have 3 of those particular similar interregional networks. In the south, we have the yellow cable that connects PJM with CERC in the Duke service territory. So all in total, in this interregional topology on the right, this represents 7 cables in the water in addition to the radial topology. It would provide 14 gigawatts of new interregional transmission capacity, 6 gigawatts potentially between ISO New England and New York ISO, 6 gigawatts between New York ISO and PJM, and 2 gigawatts between PJM and CERC. The The subsequent slides will discuss the interregional topology in more detail and show a plausible way that it could be deployed through the year 2050. This is not the only way a similar network like this could be developed, but it is one plausible way, and it could be more front-loaded or developed later in the process. The intra-region or within-region topology will be developed to be complementary with this one, and the backbone topology will extend and build upon this topology. So our different topologies that we'll be studying will be sort of building blocks of each other. Next slide, please. Yes, so this shows in 2030. This is the build out in 2030. And so we're starting here with this representation with 30 gigawatts of offshore wind. It is generally consistent with the current direction of the industry, and all cables are simple export cables connecting platform to onshore point of interconnection. This is the starting point for all of the topologies that we will study. Within region or intra-regional interlinks, such as the proposed New York mesh, could be developed soon after this in the study. Note here that the tan-colored cables are high-voltage DC cables, while the yellow cables are AC cables, high-voltage AC. Next slide, please. We'll show that 2035. In 2035, we are modeling 42 gigawatts to be connected. And we see here the first interregional multi-terminal network. The purple network shows up connecting PJM in Maryland with North Carolina. This connection is a single interlink cable connecting two platforms, forming a 4-terminal network. And note that on these slides, although we've proposed plausible POIs noted here in these slides, these should be considered as representative for the region or the zone for interpretation of the study results. We're not saying that these topologies need to be connected to these exact POIs. Also developed in the 2035 timeframe is the scenario, in this scenario, is the first leg of 2 of the northern networks, both injecting power into New York Zone J, which is New York City. These platforms will be interlinked in subsequent years in this trajectory. Next slide, please. So by the year 2040 in this trajectory, we have 55 gigawatts of offshore wind developed. One of the complete 6-terminal networks is built in the north, connecting ISO New England in the Boston area with New York ISO Zone K, which is Long Island, and PJM in New Jersey. The second leg of the red network is also built. This cable reaches to the PJM 500 kV transmission network, assuming interconnection near an existing nuclear plant. This is true for several of our injection points in PJM. If these nuclear plants do not retire after their first license extension in the late 2030s and 2040s, then alternate POIs on or near the 500 kV network may need to be found, and that's something we're currently studying and looking for potential backup options. Next slide, please. By 2045, with 70 gigawatts connected, the second of our 3 northern multi-terminal networks is assumed to be interlinked. And we build the third leg of that interlink and the second leg of the green interlink, which you'll see in the next slide, which shows 2050 with 85 gigawatts connected. This is consistent with the slide I showed earlier, and the final multi-terminal network is developed. This snapshot represents the year we will focus much of our detailed production cost modeling and economic analysis on, because this represents kind of the full build out of the interregional topology. And again, the backbone topology will be, this will be a building block of the backbone topology, and we'll also be looking at the intra-regional topology, which will be able to complement and work with or without this topology. And just to repeat the summary, this interregional topology represents 7 cables in addition to the radial topology. It provides 14 gigawatts of new interregional transmission capacity, 6 between ISO New England and New York ISO, 6 between New York ISO and PJM, and 2 gigawatts between PJM and CERC. Next slide, please. So interlinking the offshore platforms with one or more offshore networks can have a variety of potential benefits. Most of these benefits fall into these general categories. It can help reduce offshore wind curtailments in a couple of different ways. One is by being able to inject into alternate POIs while some POIs may be congested. Another is that during outages of the export cables, excess capacity on the other export cables could enable continued injection of some of the power from the affected wind area during those outages. During times of lower wind generation, the offshore network could help alleviate onshore congestion by transmitting power from lower cost regions, including areas experiencing curtailment of solar and or wind, to the higher cost regions. Offshore transmission can provide a resilience and system adequacy benefit during times when the onshore grid is stressed in specific regions. There are potentially other reliability benefits that the team is studying now. The interactions between an offshore transmission network and the onshore grid congestion, operations of the onshore grid, and the offshore wind resource are very complicated and require detailed hourly analysis to quantify. And that's what we're studying and working on right now. Next slide, please. So, in summary of some of the things that we've seen so far, both in our analysis that we're working on for this study and in discussions with stakeholders, we note that building offshore wind provides potential opportunities to leverage those investments to create economic and reliability benefits. These potential opportunities have led to states and regions proposing and studying the potential benefits of interlinking offshore platforms. For example, New York's proposed meshed offshore grid and mesh-ready concept, New Jersey's similar offshore transmission network concept in their most recent offshore wind solicitation, and the New England multi-terminal network concept. One of the key goals for our study is to understand how those benefits could be extended in a larger inter-regional network that connects these different and diverse regions together, and connecting both diverse regions in terms of load, in terms of onshore resource, and in terms of offshore resource. We're developing methods to design a variety of different topologies for studying how these offshore wind investments can be leveraged. And our next steps in the study with these proposed topologies are to study them in more detail to understand the benefits, cost, and reliability and resilience impacts. Although we'll be putting efforts into quantifying the regional benefits of various topologies, we'll not be putting major efforts into studying how or whether various market structures could take advantage of some of these potential benefits. And I know Commissioner Clements mentioned this a little bit in her remarks. If you go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to flag one more time. I know I've mentioned this a couple of times, but just wanted to provide another reminder that this analysis is intended to assess the value of these potential topology designs, not really to prescribe a specific set of points of interconnection or interlinks that would be necessary to achieve these benefits. Similar networks would likely provide similar benefits. On the next slide, please. Just wanted to thank everyone for their attention. I believe we have a few minutes for questions that the team is pulling together from the chat. But for additional follow-up questions about this study in particular, please direct them either to me or the PI of the project, Melinda Marquise. And we have our email addresses here, and I believe the slides will be posted on Friday. So thanks everyone for your time and attention. Really interested in feedback on the study and incorporating that into our next steps.
Thank you, Greg. As Greg did mention, we do have time for a brief Q&A. So continue to put your questions in the chat box. We'll do our best to answer them. And Greg, you took my reminder about the slides right out of my mouth. So great job. So our first question here, how has the TRC shaped some of the offshore topology connections being studied?
Yeah, so we've had several feedbacks with the TRC on this for what we'll be studying for the offshore topologies. And they have helped, kind of refine our assumptions around the points of interconnection that we'll be looking at for the study. In terms of the topologies, we've proposed kind of a wide range of topologies to study, but really for the most part, been focused on talking about this radial topology and the interregional topology. The radial topology specifically does assume some level of holistic regional planning, such that it's not a representation of kind of worst case or bad selections of POIs, bad selections of cable routes, things like that. It's intended to represent a reasonably holistic and well-planned approach to a radial topology. And then for the interregional topology, we've gone back and forth some with the technical review committee on on our approach for developing that topology and on some of the selections that we've made. But the topologies don't really represent the TRC's specific desires on exactly what that topology would look like. So it's been developed by the team with a lot of input, but doesn't necessarily mean that that's the exact opinion of each TRC representative. And hopefully the diversity of the 4 different topologies in the end will help with that. But the methodology that we've used to develop that interregional topology has been looked at.
Great. Another question. How are ongoing activities related to planned transmission at the state level being factored into the study?
Yeah, so we're trying to, obviously there's a lot of motion and change in this industry right now. And we're trying as we go to incorporate some of these changes and both in terms of specific projects that have been either awarded or proposed, and also general philosophies. So one of the things that we're doing is kind of looking at this, the radial topology as a more holistically planned topology to represent kind of the general motion of the industry towards, for example, larger projects, HVDC cables in many instances for representing some of the solicitations in New York and New Jersey, and some of the work, I believe Representative Ross cited the Brattle study that looks at some of that holistic planning. So this is kind of a step beyond the recommendations from the Brattle study and does assume some of that holistic planning.
Thank you. How was ocean co-use considered in the building of these topologies? You mentioned some environmental and siting data layers. How were they integrated into the modeling?
Yeah, if you could go back to the radial topology slide, I think it was slide 3 or maybe 4 in my deck, and look at that map. So basically, the ocean co-use was primarily used for our path routing methodology, which we used to develop the radial topology and some of those interlinks in between. Actually, this is a fine example to look at. And so this path routing methodology basically looks at a variety of different siting layers, which include some of those co-uses, both environmental, military, Army Corps of Engineers, unexploded ordnance, danger sites, things like that, and basically avoids all of those and finds the optimal route between, actually we used it to route between every location in the ocean and all of the POIs that we had pre-selected. And then basically all those different potential paths are mixed together with the quality of the offshore wind resource to kind of pick the best set of selections that would path route around those exclusions and connect the best offshore sites to the best points of interconnection.
Great. I think we have time for one more question here. From the topology study so far, how did the values of reliability, resilience, capacity, production cost savings, emission savings, et cetera, compare in terms of economic significance? The second part is, what are the top 3 value streams?
Yeah, so I'm gonna have to punt a little bit on this question. We're not done with the analysis yet, and we're not quite prepared to talk about some of the analysis that we have done because it's currently in review. So we've completed some of the production cost modeling, looked at some of those value streams, and we're diving into more detail in the reliability analysis right now. But we've kind of carefully selected specifically the interregional topology to represent what is likely the highest value lines, the highest value set of lines, and tried to connect those with, connect those different points of interconnection based on our modeling to understand where we would be likely to see that highest value. So we've kind of specifically looked for and plucked all those highest value streams, but we haven't really done a complete assessment of the 4 different topologies yet.
Great, thank you. I know we've got a lot of packed schedule today, so thank you to everyone for all their questions, and thank you. We will have additional time for Q&A following each of today's presentations. And any questions that we didn't get to today, we'll try to use them to put together an FAQ with some answers to your questions, and we'll let you all know when those are available. So you can continue putting your questions in the chat box at any time. So thank you again, Greg. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks. And please feel free to follow up.
I would like to introduce our next speakers. We'll hear from Alyssa Baker, Offshore Wind Transmission Lead with the Grid Deployment Office at DOE, and Josh Ganji, the Renewable Energy Program Specialist at BOEM on the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission recommendations. Alyssa, Josh, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here. If we get to our first slide, we'll jump right in. Obviously, Greg covered a ton of really great material about what the study's showing us so far and where we think we're headed with that. Whatever the topology ends up being, we're seeing some trends that are making us think, we're going to need to take some actions here to set things up so that that's achievable for us in a long time. And that's some of the things that Josh and my team have been working on really closely, trying to figure out what are the actionable steps that we'll need if the topology looks something like this. So we're going to run through those today. I'm really excited to share them with you. They fall into 5 main categories. You can see them there in the color coordination on the screen. But we also broke them into different time buckets and then different criticality buckets. So those time buckets are immediate, which is from now to 2025, the near term, the midterm, and then the long term, which is 2040, 2050, and beyond. So we'll get to those as we go through today. But I did want to make a note about the criticality rating. You see those in the stars that are listed on the table here. And it should be clear that these are not necessarily a judgment of how important these are overall to the nation or any kind of formal position between our agencies on these topics. This is just a judgment of how much we think that this particular action will contribute towards an offshore transmission grid. So as we go through these, you'll see these throughout the document, throughout the presentation today. But in the near term, we're really looking at the critical actions involved getting folks together. It's building these collaborative bodies. It's clarifying some of the building blocks of transmission planning through POI identification, planning standards, and then addressing the significant costs associated with transmission. So we will do these one at a time so you can go through them. There should be a blank in your form to provide feedback for each of these as they come up. Josh, why don't you take over our next slide?
Great, thanks, Alyssa. So one of the key takeaways we had was that there are many levels of regulation and permitting, both offshore and onshore, there needs to be more work done to work together to coordinate these processes. So these are sort of a few of those options that we're recommending in the report. First, a multi-state offshore wind transmission collaborative involving Atlantic states to promote a shared vision and provide input for multi-state level planning at the ISOs and RTOs. A regional transmission collaborative involving the joint ISO RTO planning committee with support of the RTOs and non-regulated states to jointly include state policy goals and the incorporation of the Atlantic offshore wind transmission study into the planning processes. And also the establishment of a transmission task force for federal agencies, tribal nations, state and local governments to discuss the siting of regional projects and align the permitting processes. So really we're looking at all of the collaboration that needs to go on across all of the multi-levels of planning and review. We did consider, there was a suggestion that we heard oftentimes about the creation of a new RTO or planning organization focused on offshore facilities. And this was raised as a potential solution in many of our feedback sessions. However, the challenges associated with adding this new planning entity and the time needed to stand up the organization and define jurisdiction and roles leads us to not recommend the option at this time. Next slide.
So the next couple of recommendations are rather technical in nature. Of course, we know that there are limited points of interconnections along the coast and even more limited landfall locations along the coast. So we really need to be thoughtful in all stages of planning about how we're using those and then how we're communicating information about their availability. So we really want to holistically, increase what we're doing, holistically increase how we're using these limited POIs and landfalls. We're encouraging DOI to publish identification methods, provide some technical assistance in that form, and then we're including our transmission planners and our states and their active role in doing the studies and then using those study results to inform some of these procurement actions. Next slide. Reliability standards. The NERC has some fabulous transmission planning criteria. However, a lot of that criteria was, of course, built with onshore transmission in mind, right? So there's terms that are really specific to, the right-of-ways, the structures, the towers that we use in onshore. And some of that just needs to be clarified for an offshore setting, right? When you're burying cables, things look a little bit different. And without that clarification, a lot of our, the people designing these systems, proposing them, have some uncertainty. They're not sure exactly what they need to be doing, and of course, as an engineer, I can say we all safely say, oh, if I'm not sure, I'm just going to add this margin, and so these make our projects more costly, more difficult. So we really want to get to the heart of the issue and clarify what these standards really need to be to ensure that our new system is reliable and dependable when we need it most. Next slide.
Thanks. So we are also encouraging states and RTOs to pursue voluntary cost allocation based on mutually agreed upon methodologies. Transmission cost allocation is notoriously a thorny issue and is often identified as one of the hardest problems to overcome. In June 2021, FERC issued a policy statement addressing state efforts to use voluntary cost agreements for transmission development and encouraged use of such agreements. In addition to these benefits outlined by FERC, this could help minimize litigation over cost allocation issues, shorten timelines for generator interconnection requests, and in many regions, generators must take on the majority of costs or all costs for any network upgrades, which could lead to withdrawal from the queue and new studies, thus delaying the ability to connect and meet the goals for interconnection. So by finding ways to voluntarily move this process forward and assign costs, we would significantly reduce some of the potential obstacles here. Next slide, please.
As we get into these 2-star recommendations, I'm going to start covering these a little bit more quickly. Just because we have a lot today, we will post these slides so you can get into the nitty-gritty and kind of study them at your leisure. That's one of the reasons why we have so much text on the slide, because we know that that's a resource that will be useful. So getting into these immediate actions here, network-ready equipment standards, right? New York has done a great job of starting that. We need to have that be more commonly used and available throughout the coast. So as we're connecting different regions, our standardization is the same, and we know that we have plug-and-play operability. We also need to look at our equipment ratings for transmission components and standardize them to help with the burden on our supply chain, right? We don't have enough supply chain capacity, manufacturing capacity to be doing one-off designs, and we really kind of need to conform to what our factories are already putting out, what's already available, and how do we do that to ease the burden there. Next slide. We also need to be working on some R&D. There's some things here that we're kind of on the cutting edge. We're going to need them in the next 5, 10, 15 years. So that's going to be a big priority for us. The expansion of our supply chain and manufacturing capabilities. It's something we need to expand domestically. We don't have a ton. There's a global shortage, but if you were to only consider the US capacity, we definitely have some work to grow there. And then here we have workforce development. This is a huge opportunity, and one of the things we're really excited about is that this industry and this development we're planning has the potential to bring a ton of new jobs, a ton of new growth and domestic prosperity, but we need to get those workers trained. We need to let people know what's available and get them ready to do these jobs. Next slide.
Thanks. As any easement or right of way issued by BOEM inherently needs to continue through state waters and on land, there's a need for alignment on siting between the siting authorities. We recommend continued work building off the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Study to work on a siting study and further refinement through marine spatial planning and needed survey work. We also recommend that there's a need to develop guidance regarding authorization and permitting for more complex transmission solutions where there's not a precedent. So this could include where there's multiple offshore wind projects connecting through third-party transmission systems, and both right-of-ways and easements are implicated. Such guidance could potentially be supported through the Transmission Siting and Development Grant Program. That being said, there's also a need to hire, train, and retain staff that can navigate the complex regulatory and permitting processes at federal, tribal, state, and local governments in response to the increasing number of projects. We recommend that DOE, BOEM, and other federal agency partners explore and implement funding mechanisms to support the capacity of the often resource-constrained tribal nations and local governments to meaningfully engage in this process. For federal agencies, direct hiring authority is also recommended for expedient and effective hiring. Next slide, please. So we also encourage continued interagency work on research and development specific to transmission siting or environmental impacts from transmission infrastructure. We're also recommending developers and states look to develop offshore wind transmission. They carefully review and apply for existing and upcoming funding opportunities made available through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Acts. Next slide, please. So we're now moving to the 2025 to 2030 recommendations. Actions recommended here focus on shifting practices to reach near-term targets, as 2030 is a critical year for both the Biden-Harris administration's offshore wind development goal, as well as the procurement goals of several states. So actions in this timeframe will pave the way for the development of the offshore transmission network. Just go ahead and jump to the recommendations then. Next slide.
So the first recommendation here is just bringing together these multi-state collaborative bodies and the JIPC to start looking at, at this point, the Atlantic study is done. We've got a couple years of planning under our belts. It's time to really talk about what interregional belts we need and what do we need to do to get there. So that's our first action here. Next slide. HVDC standards development is also going to be key. HVDC multi-terminal grids are rather new. We don't have a lot of communications and control standardizations. But as we get to this point in our timeline, we're going to need not only equipment standards, but operability standards, so that we can be assured that the communications and controls will work exactly how we think they should when we start connecting multiple regions with these HVDC systems. Next slide.
So now we're starting to also discuss how we identify and promote specific routing options for offshore transmission infrastructure. So in this case, BOEM could continue to work with DOE and other permitting agencies to identify preferred transmission routing paths based in part on the transmission topologies identified in the study to accommodate these longer-term goals. We could then conduct geophysical surveys and geotechnical investigations that are needed to refine and support the development of these routes. This could potentially be funded by federal sources. The data would then be made available to lessees and potential grantees for use in the process. Such preferred routes should be wide enough to accommodate shared infrastructure for multiple projects and could be further refined as needed. The use could be further incentivized by the use of bidding credits for new lessees and terms and conditions of the leases and grants. Next slide, please.
Regulatory guidance is something that has been asked for a lot throughout this process. We've heard that from several entities and folks. Essentially, when we're talking about starting with radial projects and then building them into network assets, you get into some interesting regulatory concerns about something that was a radial line is now part of the bulk electric system network. It has new implications for new requirements that now the operators have to maintain. It has some new implications for cost recovery. So things get a little bit muddy when we talk about doing that, and what's the position the developers are in who built them as radial lines and now they're being used for something else. So we've got recommendation around that, and then also data sharing for HVDC offshore systems. Obviously, there's a lot of proprietary information and black box models that go into these HVD systems that our equipment manufacturers are putting together. And that's important that we protect their proprietary information and their commercial viability in that way. But our RTOs, our transmission planning, they need some data so that they can model and study things and know what the system is going to operate like. So we need to navigate how we do that data sharing gracefully so that folks have what they need without compromising the commercial viability of our developers. Next slide.
Great. So building upon the previous recommendation that I introduced for the identification of preferred routes, BOEM could also issue one or more requests for competitive interest for regional transmission systems, utilizing right-of-ways in the preferred routes. This would also solicit information and feedback on preferred technology standards and obligations under these solicitations. This could be conditioned with capacity and technology requirements to ensure future expansion or utility, and could incorporate timing requirements to progress through the regulatory framework. It should be noted that BOEM can also condition COP approval on projects where use of a system in these areas are developed and would be deemed beneficial. So we also need to take a look at the role of among states. So we recommend that state renewable portfolio standards or offshore wind goals be amended to allow for full or partial credit where investment in offshore wind transmission infrastructure also helps a neighboring state achieve its goals. This could lead to a reduction in state border disputes and competition and better identify and promote the shared benefits of shared infrastructure. Next slide.
Community benefits agreements. I actually really like this one. It's a great way. We know that offshore wind brings great benefits environmentally, and it's good for our economy. Transmission can bring reinforcement, but for local communities that are having to site and live with the construction and the ongoing existence of these assets, sometimes that doesn't always seem like a good thing for them locally. So community benefits agreements are something that have been used, and we encourage their continued use between developers and local communities to get together, have important conversations about what projects are being proposed, what the impacts are to the community, what the individual community needs are, and then how we can have a win-win scenario there, right? How do we bring in funds to help alleviate some of these perceived negative impacts, or how do we fix things while we're here? So we definitely encourage developers to continue to use these, and communities to ask for them, to help design them, to figure out what you want to see when these projects are coming through your areas. Next slide.
So now we get to jump to 2030 to 2040. In this time period, we're anticipating a need to ramp up for long-term needs. And in this time horizon, interregional offshore transmission is expected to play a larger role. While the infrastructure previously planned and discussed earlier is under construction, new critical actions will be needed to continue this progress. This could include the establishment of testing for HVDC, revisions to frameworks, and codification of standards that have been previously identified. So why don't we go ahead and jump to the recs there. Next slide.
Our first critical action in this time frame is a multi-terminal HVDC test and certification center, which is a big technical mouthful. But it's a center of excellence that can do a lot of this testing and certification for these new systems, these new components, and judge how they interplay and interact with each other. There are a couple of these centers that exist internationally. Some of our neighbor countries have these available for us, and we'll probably have to use them in the first couple years of developing HVDC systems offshore. But we really want to stand something up domestically. We think that this is an important thing, that we have this domestic capability and this domestic expertise that we can validate and do the testing that we need to develop the grid here in the Atlantic in this time frame, but also by then it'll probably be needed for the Pacific, the Gulf, other areas. So we've got some great ideas for what we think the center needs to be capable of doing, and some things to keep in mind when designing and standing something like this up, but I think it'll be a really key thing for us going forward. Next slide.
Thanks. When we look to environmental review and permitting frameworks and how they'll evolve over time, we will be learning as we progress more complex projects through the regulatory and permitting frameworks, and there will be a need to continue to improve the process. So we recommend that roles and responsibilities of each entity and jurisdiction are fully understood and defined based on the learnings of the process, and coordinated with a comprehensive permitting timetable, and particularly where multiple simultaneous projects can affect each other's abilities to interconnect to the grid. So really defining who does what when, essentially. We also recommend that BOEM continue to work closely with tribal nations to identify natural, archaeological, and cultural resources, as well as areas of historic significance early in the process, and continue to find ways to improve our consultation process. For projects covered under FAST 41 that are qualified for that, we recommend continued encouragement that the cooperating agency or participating agency status is encouraged. Next slide, please.
These next recommendations, I was really glad to have Commissioner Clements here give some remarks at the beginning. We've been working with our FERC colleagues to identify some needs and talk to them about what makes sense here. But really, I think all of us, I'm sure, are pretty well aware that FERC Order 1000 only requires coordination, right? And what we see going forward is a need for true joint planning, which we just don't have a framework for right now. So we're excited that FERC is already considering these issues. We encourage those because we think it's going to be important going forward. So we need to be having states talk with other states, different planning regions, to be able to come together and really plan interregional projects. Part of that is going to be interregional transfer capacity minimums. We think this is a really solid idea too. This will increase our onshore systems reliability and resilience, particularly when we see a rise in locational issues or regional storms affecting specific issues. Having an increase in our ability to transfer power between planning regions is going to be good. It's gonna protect the consumers. It's gonna protect us from having blackouts, brownouts, that sort of thing. So, we know there's a lot of different ways to calculate interregional transfer capacity, and we're not advocating for any specific calculation method. We're not advocating for a specific threshold or a flat percentage that would apply nationally. But we are saying that, this is something that we think should be considered going forward, and it's something that we should do some modeling around and figure out what makes sense for the regions. How do we ensure the greatest reliability based on local system dynamics? Next slide.
Great. Although it may be hard to think about it now, as this time period also has implications for sort of how we move infrastructure forward as the initial offshore wind projects begin to reach the end of their lives. As they're starting to be decommissioned or considering decommissioning, there's a higher likelihood that the substations and export cables that were initially built as part of these projects may have been incorporated into shared infrastructure or mesh networks. Accordingly, we recommend developing guidance or potentially regulatory revisions to allow the continued use of transmission infrastructure where it would still provide value beyond the lifespan of that original offshore wind project. We also recommend that BOEM would continue to engage in knowledge exchanges with our international partners to learn best practices on dealing with issues related to the different lifespans of project components. Next slide.
Absolutely. Here we have queue reform. The interconnection queue, of course, being a challenging challenging tool to use, both as a transmission planner and as a developer trying to get through the process. It really was designed in a different era where the demands on that system were much different than the demands we see today. So, we are encouraging FERC and the transmission planning entities to kind of prioritize what reform of that process can look like in the coming years. But we're also encouraging the consideration of a commercial readiness requirements such as first ready, first served, help manage queue overloads, and sort out projects that are really ready for commercial operations from those that are more exploratory, shall we say. We also want to talk about the existing enhancing the market monitoring roles. As we talk about transmission, it's always expensive. Transmission comes with large price tags, as we know, but when it looks at offshore transmission, that's even more extreme. When we talk about connecting multiple regions, multiple states through these new lines, it's a lot of money on the table, right? And we want to make sure that we are doing that efficiently and smartly, and we are thoughtful of the ratepayer as we go through that. And so we think that there is a role for these market monitors to ensure that the generation and transmission resources are used thoughtfully. Next slide.
So the last set of recommended actions have been identified as long-term. So these are tools to help us reach development goals for 2050 and beyond. But obviously, planning and development needs to start sooner than that to make sure that we can reach those goals. Key recommendations here are going to involve strong leadership, thoughtful cost allocation, and the prudent use of national corridors, as well as focusing on maximizing the infrastructure we have and improving communication and information sharing throughout the government and among stakeholders. Next slide, please.
First up here, we have state-led transmission planning, and I'll add exactly what Josh said, but these long-term actions are kind of timeless actions, right? We think they're going to be important to today, tomorrow, and then 30 years from now. So, we cannot underestimate or understate the role of the state and the criticality of their leadership here. We've already seen tremendous action, tremendous leadership from the states along the Atlantic and engaging in several ways about thoughtful transmission planning. And we just see that there is going to be a role for that going forward into the future. So, we've got some suggestions here to help support our states and how they solicit these projects, how they design things. We've seen some really great things with states partnering with their local RTOs to use the processes that exist, modular solicitations where you can prioritize what you feel like is most impactful to your region. And pardon me, there's also a need for looking at national interest electric transmission corridors. That is a mouthful. We call those NITSEs. And these are kind of interesting. Onshore, we what the use is there, but offshore they become a little more complex because it's already federal waters, and BOEM already, of course, has jurisdiction there. So there really is no need for DOE to come in and supersede something. We also, we can't designate these in state waters. So you can't put full corridor from generation to POI onshore. However, the use of these designations can be useful because in the Inflation Reduction Act, there are some funding mechanisms, some financing that are available to projects specifically within one of these NITSE corridors. So we are investigating the ways how we can set those up to make that funding competitively available to developers who want to use it to develop offshore transmission. Next slide. Cost allocation methodology. This is challenging, right? I mean, Josh already spoke to how important voluntary cost allocation is going to be. We've also put together a recommendation, and you'll see the full thing in the report once we get that published, but there are some best practices and some ideas that we have put together to try to drive what can be useful. We think that they need to follow regional distribution of benefits. We don't think that there should be designed to focus on or compensate the lowest benefit party. They should be based on the overall benefits. And we think that, if there is a way of accounting for the extra capacity beyond what is already prescribed, that it gives us growth room, right? Because when we only plan for the needs today, tomorrow, we're back in the same boat, right? So we need to be able to allocate costs thoughtfully so that we can overbuild based on expected and really anticipated needs for the future, and roll that up into a holistic and thoughtful process. Next slide.
Great. So a lot of this slide is looking to the communication piece. So, for example, international cooperation exchanges provide valuable feedback for developing those best practices, as many international governments are further down the road in their development of the offshore wind resource. So learning from their best practices can be helpful. Again, communicating with the public, making sure that everybody knows what's going on at all different levels of government, and sharing that information early, particularly with communities that may be impacted by the decisions being made. DOE should also continue to broadly disseminate research on transmission optimization, and with expanded effort to inform the offshore wind transmission community about the potential application of grid enhancing technologies for offshore wind. And then, of course, the best practices for benefit valuation. We want to shift cost allocation methodologies to a more holistic multi-value benefit analysis in transmission planning to really capture the value of these efforts. Next slide, please. So it's also important to address the equity piece here. We want to encourage public utility commissions to consider adopting best practice standards to ensure that low income and vulnerable populations are not disproportionately impacted by decisions. The inclusion of consumer advocates early in the process to ensure that these ratepayer interests are considered, transparency is increased, and this may help to minimize public resistance to decisions being made. And then finally, we also recommend exploring the use of DoD and other federal installations along the coast that could provide appropriate cable landing sites, dock facilities, layout yards, or other existing infrastructure that can further support project development. Next slide. And with that, I just wanted to thank everybody again for joining us and really helping us refine these draft recommendations. The feedback will be sort of critical to helping us make sure we're including and fully considering everything. So I'll turn it back to Alyssa if you wanted to make any closing remarks on this.
No, I just thank everybody again. We'll get these slides up so that you can read through them in more detail. I know it is a whirlwind to cover this many recommendations on such a variety of topics in such a short, condensed time. But please do use the feedback form to submit any questions, or pardon me, any thoughts or edits to the recommendations themselves. And then please do use the chat function to send us questions. I think we've got some time for Q&A here, but I will turn it over to Whitney. Thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa and Josh. That was really, really insightful. As Alyssa did mention, we do have time for Q&A now. So feel free to put your questions here in the chat, and we can go ahead and get started. The first question I do have here is for you, Josh, but Alyssa, feel free to jump in, and vice versa when they're addressed to Josh or to Alyssa. For early tribal nation considerations and concerns, when will consultation begin on these proposals? Are there funding opportunities?
So yeah, I wanted to just reiterate that early engagement is critical, and in this effort, we initially reached out with scoping calls, some almost a couple of years ago at this point to get that process going, and have tried to make sure that we are incorporating and really listening there. For specific proposals, I don't know that I have sort of a timeline at this stage, because we would need to initiate the recommendations here. There are mechanisms, obviously, for tribal engagement throughout the process. When we look at things like the idea of a task force, this is an opportunity to get federal, tribal, state, and local governments all together in the same room to discuss, proposals that are being considered, for example. So that would be an early piece. And then, with the government to government consultation status, tribes are also free to sort of request government to government consultations at any time. So, it would sort of depend, I guess, in a nutshell, on what the proposal was and where we were in that process.
Great, thank you. Alyssa, this is for you. When would the proposed interregional lines be implemented? Would the Atlantic region be built out in 5 to 8 years?
It's the $1 million question, and I wish I could give you a definitive answer. I think, Greg went through the topology in the earlier session, and really what we're seeing is that interregional lines are not really surfacing as a need before 2030. However, transmission does take an exceedingly long time to plan and to build. So, we think it's really important that we start planning now, because it can take, I mean, depending on the situation, of course, you hear people say it can take, 10 years to build a transmission line. Could be more, could be less, of course, but it can take significant time. So, I think the first time we are identifying in our assumptions based on some early study results and where we think we need to hit the administration's targets is 2035 is where we first see those interregional lines coming up. So, if you backtrack those back 10 years, that means we need to start planning for them now within the next couple of years.
Josh, this one is addressed to you. Would there be an opportunity for states to interact with the identification of federally preferred routes?
Yes, no, I think that would be critical. As I mentioned in one of my slides, any sort of routing that BOEM would be doing inherently needs to go also into state waters and make landfall on state land. So there's really no way around that. We and not that we would want to get around it, but we really do encourage this collaborative effort to help identify the best ways to sort of optimize the limited number of points of interconnection along the coast and really avoid and minimize potential impacts to the environment and other ocean users. So I think state feedback and state input on this is a critical step.
Alyssa, this one's for you. How do you plan to work with each disparate ISO, RTO, and the transmission owner to move any of these potential transmission projects through their regional planning processes and through each state's regulatory body?
So great questions. I think the first thing is, of course, here at DOE and BOEM, similarly, we don't have the authority to mandate any kind of particular builds or to force state or RTOs to study a specific thing. We are just here to help and to partner and to provide resources and information as we can. So, I will say the White House has kicked off a federal state offshore wind task force, which has the Atlantic coastal states, the 11 of the states that have been involved from the beginning. There's probably updated numbers now, pardon me. But they're already bringing folks together to have these conversations at a state level and to help prioritize needs, particularly in the supply chain and in related issues. And one of the things we're advocating for and we'd like to help develop is a forum for transmission in the same vein. So, if we can get states to talk about these, how do we bring people to the table to plan collaboratively? For the RTOs, we've been in conversations with them. There's some fantastic planners, some fantastic organizations already out there. They've been looking at these things and talking about these things. And so, our goal with the Atlantic work is to help jumpstart those conversations, to help give them a building block so that they can take it and they can study it through. We do have some resources if needed to help to fund and support some of this work, maybe doing some ongoing study work as needed, but we'll be working with those entities to figure out exactly what that needs to look like so that they can really do the best thing that they do, which is what they're good at, right? They can study for their region.
Josh, could you share some thoughts regarding how these recommendations will be incorporated into projects that are under review right now?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of ways. First, I'd recognize, that the intention of this effort from the beginning was not to sort of to stop the planning efforts that are going on in the projects that are sort of in the pipeline. So projects that are currently under review and very advanced along this way are likely to interconnect using radial lines. And those are sort of critical because you also may be able to incorporate some of those projects into a future mesh network or expanded offshore transmission grid. That being said, there's also a lot of great planning work that's been done by the ISOs, by the states for transmission and the incorporation of current projects. And so, making sure that those are also incorporated into sort of those recommendations that would be forward-looking in sort of route planning. I think is one way. Also, BOEM has stated in our last several final status notices that we can condition COP approval of existing projects on the use of shared transmission systems where it's appropriate. So, I'm not saying every project has to be forced into, this overall ocean grid, but there may be instances where it makes sense, and some projects may voluntarily jump at the chance because that ability is there. But there are also sort of analysis methods to look into where they would best fit. So, sorry to ramble a bit there, but there are a lot of ways to incorporate current projects into this effort. Yeah. Also, I did mention for future leasing, there's discussion of potential bid credits and other mechanisms, lease conditions to incorporate some of these ideas.
Thank you. No, I think that you weren't rambling. That was a very thorough response. I appreciate it. Alyssa, this one's for you. Why would we wait until after 2050 to look at maximum the grid that we have in the long-term actions? For example, using GET's technologies, this is a much more immediate way of getting capacity to allow for more flexible POIs and less infrastructure. And technologically is ready today without the stream of additional works that have been cited as being required to deliver much of the other technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, part of it is probably a fault of trying to cram so much information into slides and order them in some way that can be digestible in such a short period of time. But, our long-term recommendations, the ones that we forecasted for 2040 and, beyond on there, are in actuality all-time solutions. They are things that we think are going to be important from now all the way out. So that includes grid enhancing technologies, GETs, as we sometimes call them, that can buy more capacity onto existing transmission systems without necessarily having to rebuild or add new lines. So, I'd say, yeah, there's definitely a role for that now. There's definitely a role for that as we get to 2050 to help increase onshore capacity and buy us some more space on the existing POIs we have. But I will say it's not necessarily a silver bullet. I mean, as we talk about just the sheer amount of power that we have to bring in new capacity from the coast into load centers, it sometimes feels like it's icing on the cake. It can buy us a little bit. It can push things out a couple years for system growth. But it's not going to replace a new 500 kV line in most cases. So, we definitely think that it's going to be important throughout this time, and it should be pursued, should be considered, but it's not something that you can do in place of some of the infrastructure builds that we've been talking about today.
Josh, I have a three-part question here for you. How long would a state federal siting study take? Where would the study focus? Would certain regions be prioritized?
I'll all good questions. And I don't know that I can give you a definitive answer on how long something like this would take. It would sort of be dependent upon, what was coming out of the current Atlantic offshore wind transmission study, as well as the study efforts and planning efforts going on in the states and in the ISOs and RTOs. Because I think we'd have to take a look at all of these various planning metrics to really figure out what made sense and what optimized things for everybody involved. Obviously for the regions being prioritized, I mean the Atlantic, much like our focus today, the Atlantic would be the initial study, and looking at the various the three sort of planning regions from the ISOs. Maybe the way to start there. So I don't know if I can give very specific answers at this stage, but a lot would have to go into the formation. Alyssa, you feel free to add anything else there if you have perspective, because you guys would also probably be implicated in that study.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's something we've talked about is, being some way that we can provide some additional technical assistance. And we've talked about how critical the POIs are, but also those landing sites and those beach crossings. And, as vast and impressive as the Atlantic offshore wind transmission study is, it really doesn't get to that granularity that we would need to inform siting. So, I'd say it's definitely something that we're teasing around it to figure out, how we can help in this area, what that role looks like, and what the scope should be. But we're going to be working with the transmission planners, right? We're going to be working with the states and talking to them to figure out what exactly they need, where they want to see stuff, so that we can really do a deep dive as we get there. But first we have to wrap up the Atlantic study, so we got to get through this year first.
Okay. Alyssa, this one is for you. It's also a two-parter. I'm going to ask you the first one first, because I think that one's a quick and easy answer. So this person says, thank you so much for the presentation. At first glance, these look like great recommendations. They wanted to clarify that they heard you correctly, that they can only provide feedback until 5 p.m. They say Eastern time. I think we had said Pacific time today. And they were asking if it would be possible to extend to ensure the high quality responses.
Yeah, I will say that, we have some regulations we have to be careful about. We didn't post this form in like the federal notice, the Federal Register notice. So we can't keep it open indefinitely. However, I will say we absolutely want your feedback. Please use the form for as long as it's open. If you want to save a copy of it and email it to us at a later date. We are working on refining and getting the report itself ready for publication. So we would love to hear your thoughtful responses, even if they take more time than close of business today, because obviously it's going to take a lot of time. Happy to have email conversations. Please reach out to us if you want to schedule one-on-one to have a face-to-face conversation around these things before things get published. But also know that, we plan on revising and just doing a sanity check once the Atlantic studies are complete as well. So come the end of the year, we'll also be doing a check and revision, and we may do some republication or some tweaking on these as needed. And then, so yeah, unfortunately, I can't leave the form up indefinitely, but you're welcome to steal a copy of it, send it to me at your leisure.
The second part of the question from this person is, why are the transmission planning reforms that are currently part of FERC rulemaking processes recommended for 10 plus years from now?
The idea there being this is when we really need to have them in place, or we're really suggesting that they need to be in place. We have this great advantage in that FERC is already considering these things, but we know that it takes, proposed rulemaking is not a fast process, not an instant process. So, we wanted to give Grace time to work through these issues, to go through the proposal process, to do feedback, to stand these things up. And we think, we're hopeful that in the immediate time, we see a path that we can meet our near-term needs without a formal FERC process, right? I mean, Commissioner Clements, I love it when she says, like she did at the beginning, that, FERC's working on this, but you don't have to wait for us. And I think that that's kind of what you're seeing in the recommendations, is that we really want to get there formally, but we think there's a lot of things that can be done in the near term without that formalized process in place.
Thank you. Josh, this one's for you. If export cable corridors are being considered, what protections will be afforded to developers that use those corridors, as cable aggregation is one corridor increases the risk of cable faulting because of fishing, anchoring, etc.?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts there. First, any installation of cables would have to undergo sort of the regulatory process that the BOEM puts out, and part of that would be a cable burial risk assessment. So identifying potential obstacles there. In addition, I think some of the feedback we heard from ocean users was that there was a preference generally for having sort of fewer, wider cable areas, as opposed to sort of just cables randomly connecting all of the projects throughout the OCS. And so any cables would end up being sort of charted, and there'd be more awareness. And one thought would be that if you are sort of having corridors or preferred routes that have multiple projects running through them, there may be more awareness there in that process. So there is also sort of the technical process of how you bury things, how you mark things, if there are cable crossings required, what sort of burial methods are needed to ensure safety there. So again, at the project specific level, there'd be a lot more being considered there.
Great. Alyssa, in terms of HVDC standardization, would there be consideration of adopting the Interopera/Horizons Europe standards and thus save time?
I'm going to say yes. I can't recall off of the top of my head exactly all of the standards and details that are in that, so I don't want to go on the record and say, yes, we're adopting these standards by any means. One of the things we're recommending is the first step is a survey of the existing standards that exist out there. Particularly, our European neighbors have kind of a leg up on us here. They have a few years head start in developing some of these things and talking about these things. And we of course we support information and knowledge sharing. We share a supply chain, a global supply chain. So I think standardizing with our neighbors is going to be key. And these standards in particular should be considered, but I don't know for sure that they are the only thing that we should consider, or the final answer there.
Great, thank you so much. Josh, does BOEM or NREL have a model offshore wind cable connection agreement?
I am not sure that we would. I defer to DOE on that.
Yeah, no, I think that would be something that we would be talking to the local transmission planners about. Those are the kind of agreements that they keep, and they probably vary from region to region. We'd have to investigate more what exactly the need was driving that question, but we're happy to look into it if that's something that we need to do.
Okay, they just renumbered things here. Okay, sorry. Are there existing forums that can be used to develop HVDC standards? That's questions for you, Alyssa.
Yes, there's some fabulous industry engineering groups. I'm scared to list them because I know I'm going to forget someone super obvious and important. But I'll also say that DOE's Wind Energy Technologies Office has a funding opportunity announcement on the street regarding some of these as well. They've been getting solicitations back from several entities on some of these ideas. So yes, absolutely. I think there are industry groups that are well equipped to start looking at these things, and we would encourage partnership with them to do so.
All right. So this one is kind of a statement and then a question with it. And Josh, it's directed towards you. Tribal inclusion needs to be mandated with commensurate funding. Tribes may want access to some data, georeference line data for sure, EIS assessment data also. Can that be coordinated?
Yeah, so one of our recommendations was to explore and implement more funding mechanisms to really engage the tribes and allow for more meaningful participation there. So we are looking into different ways to do that. I know that there are a number of sort of funding mechanisms that are discussed in a bit more detail in the report, and then also there are existing mechanisms through DOE, through BOEM, through FIPSI, really looking at this question exactly. So we agree. We think that is a correct statement that there needs to be more funding opportunities to really engage. So I don't know if I have like a very specific answer to this is the spot, but there are multiple sources, and we're encouraging continued development of them.
All right, I think we have time for 2 more questions. So Alyssa, this one is for you. Has the insurance industry been involved in the study? Are there considerations for ownership/liability given the history of the cable claims with offshore wind?
That we have had certainly some conversations with some insurance groups and some banking groups around some of these topics. I can't tell you definitively off the top of my head whether or not they are formal TRC members. I know that's definitely something that has come up. And something that I think the Loan Programs Office within DOE has been considering as well.
Great. All right, I feel like we can get this one question answered quickly, and then we'll do one last one. Where can we find more information on the Federal State Offshore Wind Task Force?
So there are currently a number of task force that renewable energy task force that BOEM stands up, both some are state and some are regional level. For example, the New York Bight task force was one that we established in order to help plan for the New York Bight lease sale and the projects that come out of it. So on our website, there are a number of meeting minutes, the sort of MOUs and charters that go along with the task forces. This would give a good idea of what something, if we were going to have a transmission specific task force, what something like that could look like. In addition, those task force could be used to discuss transmission projects if they were sort of regionally located. For example, a New York Bight task force could be convened to discuss a New York Bight specific transmission proposal. Definitely our renewable energy page of our website at BOEM. You should be able to find much more material on the task force process.
And if the question was in references to the White House's led federal state offshore wind partnership forum, you'll find media publications and press releases that the White House has put out on that. But those governors convene with White House staff and other federal agency leadership on these topics.
Thank you. And we can drop some links here in the chat. Maybe we'll put them in while we take our break momentarily, just so then people can come back to those. So last question. How will DOE and BOEM move forward with executing these recommendations or ensuring that other entities do? Are there opportunities for refinement or changes? How do we provide input?
That's the $1 million question. So it's a great one to end on. I don't know if those were structured cleverly to get us there, but that's great. Yes, so how we are implementing, it really depends on the recommendation. You guys saw there's such a wide variety in the scope and the the stakeholder group, who's the main actor in these recommendations, changes from recommendation to recommendation. Some of them are within DOE and BOEM's, jurisdiction. They're things that we can handle in-house, and we certainly will have program and staff assigned to enable those things. For the ones that have external owners, we'll just say, whether they are other federal entities, states, transmission planning groups, the like, we're here to partner with them to make that happen. If there's something that they need, and it's something that we can provide, or we can clear a roadblock to make something happen. If we can use our power as conveners to bring people together, we certainly will do that. But we aren't in a position to mandate all of these. That's just not really in our jurisdictional authority, and it's not something we're here to do necessarily. So a lot of this will come on the leadership of those entities, those organizations, those states to pick up the torch and carry it forward, because we all have a role in transmission. It's much too big for any one of us organizationally, or any state, of course, in particular. What was the last part of that question?
I can pick up a little bit too. I think,
thank you.
No, I just reiterate that yes, these are our draft recommendations. So yes, they are still being refined. So the feedback piece, the primary reason of the meeting today really is to present these and solicit feedback, because it is a continuing effort, and any of these recommendations, when we're implementing them, will continue to need your feedback to really make sure that we're doing it correctly. So again, the forum is definitely in the chat to help us today, and we'll certainly be in touch and available for comment throughout any of these processes.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'll say, whenever a recommendation came up and the owner was not us, we did the due diligence that we could in the time allotted to talk to a representative from that entity and kind of brainstorm with them about the feasibility and the impact of this. But if you are looking at this and you see yourself as the owner or representative of someone who would have to enact one of these recommendations, and you're seeing something like, that's really just not possible given our jurisdictional authority, that's really just, they're not thinking of these challenges that we have to live with, maybe we missed something. So I would say, please do reach out to us. This is the time when we can refine things and reshape them. So if you know something that we don't, that would be important for shaping this, we want to know about it, and we want to make that change, because the goal is that this becomes an actionable document for all of us, right? Which means all of these actions for all of us should be something that we can do. It's within our power, and it's within the resources that we have. So if that's not true, let us know.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all of those questions today. It was a great Q&A session. For everyone, we do have additional time for Q&A following each of today's presentations. So continue inputting your questions into the chat box at any time. We are gathering them and sharing them with the appropriate person, so your questions are being seen. Any questions we didn't get to today, we will use them to put together an FAQ, so you will be able to see that, and we will email you when that is out, so you will have all that information as well. We'll now hear from a series of speakers on the current Atlantic offshore wind transmission landscape. First, we'll hear from Bob Snook, Transmission Program Coordinator with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Bob, if you want to turn on your camera and just test your audio real quick, I will then turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm Bob Snook with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. I should start, of course, with the necessary caveat that everything I say today is my opinion and position, does not reflect the official position of the state of Connecticut or of the other New England states that are currently cooperating in the New England Joint, let's get the title right, Joint State Innovation Partnership for Offshore Wind. This grew out of an effort by the 6 New England states a little over a year ago when they published their New England Energy Visions, which included the New England States Regional Transmission Initiative. That subsequently led to all the states having a series of technical workshops and issuing RFIs, which then went into the development of a concept paper, which was then filed in December with the Department of Energy for funding opportunities. And we will be proceeding with a effort to get the necessary application in by May 19th. Should point out that the states in New England have done this, as many was alluded to by the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Study, as a regional approach, attempting to proactively plan and optimize the transmission infrastructure investments to provide the necessary benefits and, of course, reduce costs and provide for additional winter reliability for residents and businesses across New England. This joint state innovation partnership is seeking to take advantage of the fact that there are about 14 gigawatts or more of potential BOEM leaseholds off the coast of New England. We already have 4 megawatts, or 4,000 megawatts, 4 gigawatts under contract, and we are proceeding to develop hopefully develop a multi-terminal HVDC system, which would then be permitted to hopefully go interregionally, as was described in the plan that you heard earlier. The proposed partnership was between states. It will also include transmission providers, wind developers, and of course our ISO, working closely to proactively plan, identify points of interconnection, and then proceed to RFPs for actual projects. The effort here has been so far very successful. And we would like to actually take this moment to state how supportive we are of the efforts of NREL, PNNL, DOE, and BOEM. We really appreciate the work that's gone into the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Study. It is already impactful. It is helping us to do our forward planning, and it's something that will of course be an iterative process as we do the first sets of steps and then first RFPs, which will lead to future efforts. And we look forward to continuing to work with NREL, DOE, and everyone. If I may, for one or two quick other comments, the first issues that we're coming upon that have been that are time dependent include the necessary HVDC standardizations. We have to say that it's very difficult to put an RFP on the street to bring people in to bring in projects that we can then put for funding opportunities when we don't actually have the standards yet for them to bid into. So we would certainly urge immediate action on that, and also in supply chain. We're getting feedback from developers and the people we're working with, both in the United States and internationally, that just cables, for example, are in such short supply it will actually impact the ability to get the projects built. So as a consequence, we would certainly urge any efforts to do additional HVDC standardization and additionally to get the supply chain structure up and set. In sum, the future is here. We are already contracting for wind. We are already looking to file applications for the funding opportunities, and we are already working collaboratively. We would like also to continue to work with DOE and our sister states along the Atlantic coast to work interregionally. That'll take a lot of work, we recognize, but we think it's worth it. Every study we have reviewed so far has indicated that it will have significant price benefits and cost benefits for ratepayers and everyone. So thank you for this opportunity to speak, and of course, if there are any questions, I'll answer them as I can.
Thank you so much, Bob. So we will have time for a joint Q&A session with Bob and our next three presenters at the end of these presentations. So continue to submit your questions using the chat box throughout this presentation and the coming ones. I would now like to introduce Joe DeLosa, manager at the Brattle Group. Joe, I'll go ahead and turn this over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. First, I wanted to start out with a huge thank you, as Bob did, and everyone to DOE, DOI, BOEM, and all the hard work that's gone into the offshore wind transmission study. Without further ado, I'll jump into my remarks, which will have three main segments. A little bit of a preview of maybe our Google Doc submission, kind of based on our experience with offshore wind up and down, particularly the East Coast. We'll start with some points of strong agreement with the DOE recommendations. Proceed maybe to some points of clarification, which actually maybe, Alyssa, you addressed a little bit in your presentation, and then maybe end with a few points of feedback on items maybe that as we kind of continue to evaluate the results of the study, we might look to tweak a tiny bit. So we'll start first with the points of agreement. Obviously, first on our list is supporting DOE's BOEM support for mesh networks, which is consistent with what we found in our work in New Jersey, New York, as well as in New England. These models, as some have mentioned, retain the option value of using the existing generation interties to connect different regions, particularly those with large electricity price disparities, as has been shown in some recent work from the national labs mentioned by some of our previous presenters. These connections would be much more costly without such mesh-ready standards. And New York and recently New Jersey has already instituted this, as well as a number of procurements in New England. So we would encourage the mesh-ready standards to be included in any future solicitations. We also agree with DOE's recommendation against an offshore ISO. We see seams issues already as a substantially major cause of friction that limits the effectiveness of current interregional planning processes where they do exist. Creating one more additional entity to be involved in that process would only add to these seams issues and create more difficulty interacting with the many existing subgroups already in place. So next we'll move on to maybe some points of clarification. We really appreciate the highlighting the development of the reliability standards, which we agree is critical. But we also hope that that work can include solutions to mitigate single largest contingency concerns, particularly as we advance forward to more advanced solutions, including the 525 kV HVDC that has been mentioned earlier, including injections of up to 2.5 and 2.6 gigawatts. Some of the regional grid operators will not permit injections of that size currently, and so those reliability standards maybe could take that into account to enable that future technology development. On timing, which is maybe the item, Melissa, that you addressed a little bit earlier, there are several elements where we hope the time set out kind of reflect the back end of the range instead of when that work would start. First and foremost, I think I'll pick up where Bob just mentioned, obviously the HVDC standards. If HVDC standards are not developed till 2030, the systems benefiting from that standard will be close to a decade delayed after that standard is developed. So we think those standards are critical in the short term. Additionally, interconnection process reforms, which were mentioned as another set of ongoing processes, will also be critical in the short term. There are, as was mentioned, I think in a question, the ongoing FERC NOPR, but whatever the outcome of that NOPR will be will govern generator interconnection for the next decade or so. And so getting it right in this go-round is really important. A few other points of clarification. While the planning for DOE and the actual facilities is really helpful, we've also heard that the specific location of those facilities, as well as the POIs used, might need to be continually refined as the state engagement continues. These POIs are really dependent on a lot of local issues, making sure that the community is appropriately engaged and the specific parcel works for the state and the community. So we just encourage that while these high-level results are really important to understand the benefit of interregional transmission, the specific POIs can continue to be refined through some of the regional plans. And then I think our last point of clarification is actually one of the main recommendations from our recent offshore wind transmission report, which is agency resources, state agency resources. The slides and the draft focus on permitting agency resources, and it got the color of the permitting agency. But we actually, I think, want to focus a little more on the regulatory agency side. Environmental agencies have regularly performed over a long history the same level of detailed work product, and they've retained the agency staff to do that. With restructuring, utility regulation has really transformed over the last just 10 or 15 years. And so developing and reconfiguring the expertise in some of the regulatory agencies that will be required to deal with these subjects is going to require another level of focus above and beyond even that will be required for permitting agencies. And then the last item is just one point of feedback that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention, which is I believe there's continued work that will be needed to identify the particular entity actually best suited to lead the multi-state engagement with all interested parties that everyone has identified as being so critical to moving this forward. The draft report sets out the JIPC as the entity that might engage some of these states to look forward, but it also mentions the limitations of Order 1000. And unfortunately, JIPC is also limited by some of those Order 1000 limitations that are appropriately identified in the slides. And so we maybe wanted to suggest an alternative option that could be considered that has some record of success, which is governor-led agreement. I know there's also been some discussion today about the 9-state joint offshore wind task force on the issue of siting and particularly fisheries mitigation. This model has also been used in RGGI as well as the development of MARCO. And so we would offer to the group and to the industry the idea of, pursuing a governor-led DOE state partnership. We know the Fisheries Compensation Group includes representatives from all of those agencies as well as the states. And it has a lot of similarities to voluntary transmission cost allocation in that the Fisheries Mitigation Fund is assembling and then assigning out to different states a pot of dollars to mitigate any negative impacts from fisheries. And that sounds an awful lot like voluntary cost allocation in that every single state will have to agree to that ultimate allocation and the process. So we just wanted to leave some of those thoughts with our hearty thanks for all the efforts that have gone into to this report, and looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Joe. Again, please submit your questions for Joe using the chat box, and we will bring him back up for Q&A after the next two speakers. I would now like to take a chance to introduce Sam Salustro, the Vice President of Strategic Communications at the Business Network for Offshore Wind. Sam, I can see you, and I can hear you.
Great. It's great to be here. Going third, there's going to be a lot of repetition, I feel like. Hello, I'm Sam Salustro, Vice President of Strategic Communications here at the Business Network. For the audio tech, do I have slides or do I not have slides?
You do. We can just say next slide. We can drive the next slide.
Okay, next slide, please. Next slide again. For context, Business Network for Offshore Wind is a nonprofit organization that is working to advance the supply chain. We do that through information, education, and introductions. Next slide. We have 550 members currently. A vast majority of those members are considered corporate or supply chain members. Those are vessel builders, marine service companies, unions, fabricators, engineers, electrical contractors. Next slide. Real quick, this is I'm gonna commend everyone for this work and my love of maps. So here's a map of what the current market looks like. Green areas are leased and have secured financial offtake. Yellow areas are just leased and have not secured financial offtake. As Bob said earlier, the market is here and the market is already moving. Next slide. As evidenced by this schematic that we have. This is sort of like the numbers behind the scene, our dashboard. So states have already committed to 77 gigawatts of goals. 44 gigawatts of those are on the East Coast alone. 17 gigawatts are under contract. That number is really going to jump this year because New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Massachusetts are all undergoing solicitations as we speak, or ongoing solicitations. Connecticut might be too. And we're already seeing success. The states driving this forward have nurtured in an environment where investment is coming into the United States. $17 billion is already coming in. The map on the far left is manufacturing facilities. We've tracked over a dozen manufacturing facilities that are going to be building the towers and the cables and the blades that are going to be used. 33 new vessels and retrofits. And a little hard to see, but you can see the chart that's going up on the far right. That's a voluntary supply chain database that we have. And since the Biden-Harris administration has come into office, that has jumped 83%. That's a doubling of the number of companies that want to be involved in offshore wind. These investments are being fostered or have come to be because of trust in a consistent and reliable permitting schedule on the federal side, and that includes transmission questions. Next slide. Something that we're very excited about with this report is that it started with the assumption that we are going to have a big market. At the network, we've always pushed this understanding with the industry and with policymakers to assume that we're actively living in a 110 gigawatt market. I said state goals are 77 gigawatts right now. You can see how it's been escalating using sort of rudimentary assumption, not rudimentary, but conservative assumptions. We can map out a path to 110 gigawatts, and that barely considers the effect that new technologies are going to have on industry demand, like green hydrogen. So first off, commending this report for working backwards, assuming the big market and working backwards to say how can we help build it in the best way possible. Next slide. We've been talking a lot about timing. One of our concerns is making sure that recommendations and whatever policies or procedures that may come out of this are reflective of the fact that the industry is being built right now. We have 12 gigawatts nearing the end of environmental review. Those are projects that have already designated their cable routes, designated their interconnections, and are already in an interconnection queue. There's probably 20 gigawatts of projects where they probably have some sort of path to grid. You can say it like that. And understanding that planning takes time. New Jersey State Agreement approach, Joe can correct me, but that took at least 2 years to complete, and that was just a one state singular project. In short, regional planning, multi-state planning, interregional planning, it's best when it begins soon, advances quickly, and takes into consideration project status. Next slide. So as a supply chain organization, the Business Network for Offshore Wind got interested in transmission as an understanding that without a reliable transmission solution, a market would not develop in a timely manner, in a sustainable and robust manner. In 2019, we formed a working group of developers, suppliers, public sector, headed by John Dalton and Power Advisory. This working group has published 3 papers. First in 2020 was about general awareness of the need for planned or coordinated transmission development. The second is about the unique role that the federal government can play as a facilitator and helping to address difficult cost allocation questions. And the third, which focused on steps of setting up a workable framework states could use to advance a multi-state transmission project within a singular RTO. Common themes between those that I'm going to say are reflected in this report: measuring and weighing all benefits, environmental, economic, reliability, to say a few, incorporating public policy requirements and goals, planning proactively and for a longer time horizon. And finally, a common theme is the importance of the federal role and federal funding to support development. Next slide, and one more, please. Both Bob and Joe already really touched on this, but to start off, we are very, very excited about this draft report about the progress that the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Study has made. We commend you. So a couple very positives right off the bat. We are very excited that this goal, that this I'm going to call it a map or a storyboard exists, really lays out a wonderful roadmap ahead for the states and industry that they can aim towards, utilize in their planning, and simply have in hand to talk about. This makes everything more digestible and more possible, especially on the policy level, on the state policy level. And goals are important. The administration's 30 gigawatt by 2030 goal has really focused efforts on the federal, state, and industry level towards a common goal. Like I said before, we are very pleased that this starts with a big market assumption and works backwards. We think that this is easily a 110 gigawatt market. Recognizing that reality only produces the best outcome. And finally, as Joe and Bob also said, we are hearing a ton about standardization too, and the need for it. It's key to a quick build out and ensuring compatibility between projects. Like Bob said, we're hearing it directly from our suppliers, for our members who are the supply chain and are the suppliers, that they need standardization to frankly help deal with manufacturing capacity constraints, making sure that we can build enough, but also design and engineering constraints. Our engineering firms and our design firms only have so many people. One of the recommendations of this report was talking about workforce development, and frankly, we don't have enough people to design all these things. So standardization helps alleviate those bottlenecks. Europe is moving aggressively in this direction, as was mentioned before, in recognition of their own similar problems. Additional considerations: the report touches on the IRA tax, Inflation Reduction Act tax treatments, which desperately need adjustments. We really need to recognize offshore wind transmission projects as it relates to the tax code. Otherwise, it becomes economically harder to justify cross-project transmission systems. State collaboration, Joe spent time talking about it. We wish that we had Bobs in every single state, but we really encourage the final DOE report to recommend concrete ways to drive state collaborations. It's always been a theme from the business network that the federal government sits in a unique facilitator role that can really help move partnerships forward. Passive recommendation, just encouraging states to get together, may just result in not enough action that we need. And it is always hard for states to weigh external costs and benefits in pursuing coordinated transmission. They find it hard to justify multi-state agreements before it's too late within this industry. The federal government can play that unique convening role, and Joe just listed off a bunch, but we've always considered the fate of state and federal partnership collaboration as maybe one of those key places where that collaboration begins. Finally, I hope the report considers state limitations for funding, for planning abilities, and for political reasons. Financially, most obviously, a possible path forward for building out a transmission system lies with ratepayer-supported system cost allocation measures. We're already seeing some of that pushback from states. We really need creativity here to help move past some of these first hurdles that we're running into. And secondly, political winds can change, and state support, if this system is dependent on state support could ebb and flow. And we really encourage DOE to maintain the driver's seat position here to help continue and advance planning activities in case that there's a time when a state suddenly loses support for engagement within a transmission path forward. So, but overall, really commend the work here, as Joe and Bob said. Very excited for this report.
Thank you, Sam. So again, if you've got any questions for Sam, please put them in the chat box. We'll bring him back up here momentarily when we have our joint Q&A. I would now like to introduce Zach Smith, Vice President, System and Resource Planning and Chair of Eastern Interconnection Planning Collaborative at New York ISO. Zach, I can see you. Do you want to check your audio real quick?
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. The floor is yours.
Great. Good afternoon, folks. As mentioned, I'm Zach Smith, Vice President of System Resource Planning at the NISO, but today, especially representing the Eastern Interconnection Planning Collaborative, I am the chair of that organization that is a collection of planning coordinators from across the eastern half of the U.S. We actually have a very good history with DOE and a collaboration with them. Our organization started back in 2009 as a technical organization, and we still are a technical organization that puts together all of the planning coordinators, the majority of the planning coordinators in the eastern half of the U.S. to coordinate on interregional issues, and especially interregional transmission planning. Shortly after we were formed, I believe it was in the 2010 timeframe, we engaged with DOE under a grant to evaluate various expansions of the grid throughout the eastern half of the U.S. And really, what we bring to bear is our technical expertise. It's a collection of the ISOs and RTOs from across the eastern half of the U.S., along with all of the other entities that have planning responsibilities. And through that technical expertise, we feel we can really help provide and facilitate achievement of transmission planning goals, and to do so in an efficient way. So the work that we did back in 2010 looked at, the trade-offs, if you will, the opportunities for transmission potentially across the eastern U.S. And what opportunities there may be that are worth pursuing. Since that study effort, which was a collaboration with state agencies and state entities, we have continued our efforts in the many years that followed to continually look at what is needed on the system. And I think that this Atlantic offshore wind study is a great example of some good work being done by DOE, NREL, BOEM, and others towards something that was very much at the front of a lot of people's minds. Another organization that was referenced in some of the material today is JIPC, which is the Joint ISO RTO Planning Committee here in the Northeast. It consists of PJM, the New York ISO, and ISO New England. And a couple of years ago, we in the Northeast here were getting a lot of feedback from our stakeholders about everything that's getting discussed here today. The idea that offshore wind is coming. Each one of our states, in some different way, shape, or form, had a goal or had goals developing for offshore wind, and it was becoming apparent that it could very quickly become a challenge to integrate that. So right as those three entities, PJM, NISO, and ISO New England, were starting to think about how do we tackle this on an interregional basis, very conveniently along came DOE and NREL suggesting this Atlantic offshore wind study. So to a lot of the comments and recommendations made in the earlier presentation, and some of the comments you just heard from my fellow panelists, there's a lot of coordination that's needed. There's study work that's needed to consider the right way to tackle offshore wind going forward. A number of states, again, here in the Northeast, like New Jersey, New York, a number of the New England states, each are pursuing offshore wind, but to do it efficiently in the future, it really will be best to have that be some type of organized or collaborative effort. Through EIPC or JIPC, any of our interregional organizations, we stand ready to assist the states, assist DOE and the federal government in understanding what types of issues and challenges we are facing on the transmission system, on the grid, and how can we be helpful to help get offshore wind integrated and to do it in an efficient way. Once again, I think the presentation earlier touched upon a number of important topics, a number of very useful recommendations. I'll just acknowledge right now, thanks to the DOE, BOEM, and other staff in listening to us, and the collaboration we've had thus far over the last year plus on the Atlantic offshore wind study. They are listening, and we really appreciate that. We have a lot of insights and inputs, and we can tell that they're all ears. We greatly appreciate that, and we really look forward to continuing to work with you, whichever organization it is that we're working through. But I see in the presentation before a definite recognition of the need for coordination among the states. And that's something that from the EIPC standpoint that we've pointed out, we could do studies for years. That's what we do. We do studies. But if it doesn't have an end objective, if it doesn't have a political support or policy support, it's difficult sometimes to see where those studies are going. So, I'm happy to see recommendations such as DOE, other agencies facilitating task forces, workshops, any kind of organization between federal and state levels, just to understand how can everything be working together. I thought it was really encouraging to hear comments like, recognizing ongoing policies, recognizing ongoing efforts, and how can we get that to dovetail with what's being presented here in the Atlantic Offshore Wind Study. So a lot of great work that has been done thus far. I think that shows in the presentation prior to this panel. And as I said, EIPC is ready to assist how we can in a technical way. A concern of ours is being just handed the transmission ball, if you will, without having that state support, without having policy support for interregional transmission. Rather, I think there's value in exactly what's been recommended, having some study work that shows what are the options. I think the Atlantic Offshore Wind Study is going to do the major load of that. But then, we'll continue to work with the federal government and various state agencies to figure out what the most efficient way is to a reasonable conclusion there. So I'm happy to be here today to participate on this panel and to answer questions that anyone here has and to help address any feedback to the DOE and BOEM folks. And I just really thank everyone for inviting us to participate in this and the ongoing collaboration. Thanks.
Thank you, Zach. So we now have time set aside for a brief Q&A. So we're going to be bringing everybody back up here on the screen who just presented. Please continue to input your questions in the chat box for all of our presenters, and we'll do the best to answer them. So let's go ahead and get started with our first question. This one is here for Joe. What is the best way to initiate a governor-led multi-state planning initiative, and how can advocates and other interested stakeholders play a part in this process?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So just like Zach mentioned, it really requires the political support from kind of within the states. So I would encourage, if this is the ultimate recommendation of the DOE study, I think that will be an important first step in terms of clarifying the ask from a wide array of different potential advocacy organizations into kind of one policy ask. And I think everyone, depending on your particular role of the questioner, everyone will have their own role to play in order to attempt to bring that policy forward. And then I think the planning will be in response to that letter. I will also point out that in the 9-state letter that founded this Fisheries Compensation Fund, there is at least a nod to transmission planning. It is not enough to start I would say, 9-state transmission collaborative, but it shows that at least those states are already thinking along these lines about the importance of coordinated transmission.
Great, thank you so much. I did want to note, if any of the other panelists want to jump in on any of the responses, feel free to do so. Even though I'm addressing one person, it's completely fine.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I would actually like to jump in on this one. I agree with what Joe said entirely. I would also add that what worked in New England, we got all 6 states to support the concept plan that's for a full, multi-terminal HVDC transmission build out. It took 2 years. What first had to happen was we had to have the state staff planners start talking amongst each other and then get the attention of the state energy officers, who then discussed it with the office of the governor in each state. The idea was to present the benefits and the value to it. And also, I'll be frank about this, since we're all here to learn, we also pointed out what would happen if we didn't do collaborative, proactive planning, if it's just build as usual, which we went to our ISO and they told me that if you don't do this, one half of your transmission grid will have to be, it will be overduty to be out of its rating. It will cost billions. I noticed that governors and legislators responded to that. So that it's cheaper to proactively plan now than it is to wait for reliability type disasters. So from then we decided to have the governors reach out, each governor to governor, to find out what are the common areas. Now we had different climate plans, we had different RPSs, we had different political parties, but the governors were able to find that there are a list of common elements. For example, reducing costs, which is something they all, and that became the New England Energy Visions. And then staff went back to start coming up with RFIs to see what do people think are a good idea. We found it best to come up with at least a plan, even if it's almost like a cartoon plan, so that people would react to it. And then we put that out for a second set of RFIs. In my experience over the last 2 years, it takes about 4 meetings with staff and energy officers of the governors until the governors were comfortable coming up with a public statement, and then we had to have regular scheduled meetings so that it just didn't drop off. I would love to have the advocates, and that would include, and we also even reached out to TOs, academics, anybody. If you got an idea, please send it to it. We got all sorts of really great ideas. The governors loved it. And then we had a couple of major press releases, and then the plan came together. Worked pretty well.
Great, thank you. And Bob, that led into a question I was about to ask you, so you already answered it. I appreciate you jumping in there. So a little bit related. So Bob, based on your experience, what challenges do you anticipate with executing a multi-state and RTO collaborative forum?
That'll depend on each set of states that's involved in each RTO. Some of the challenges, of course, are also cost allocation. We have found that one way to minimize that is to say, well, we can't do cost allocation until we know the cost. So, and since our projects are largely dependent, and I have to stress this, we need DOE funding to go forward. I have had one project come in before the DOE funding opportunities were there, and we simply couldn't. There was no way a state could afford to do this. So what we did was we sort of put cost allocation. We would probably be using a voluntary state approach, but that decision has not been made. And we also had to start looking at the benefits really hard. Production cost is not the only benefit, and that's not going to work. We needed to look at reliability benefits, avoided transmission build-out costs. Like I said earlier, I can save up to 2,000 miles of 345 kV line, depending upon where on land, depending upon where I inject my offshore wind. Once we started getting real numbers like this, it became very helpful. But the challenges are, there are going to be some siting challenges. You have to bring in equity, diversity in your environmental justice communities. You can't just keep building out transmission on a disadvantaged and overburdened community. It's not going to work. So they became some of our strongest advocates, as well as many of the environmental groups to address climate issues. So you get your allies together, but the challenges are going to be, one, this is complicated stuff. It's not easy to communicate this. You have to do it time and again. You have to think carefully about your target audiences, and then also bring in everybody. Make sure you talk to your ISO and RTO. Don't, like I heard, was you don't spring it on them, and then something like that. It has to be, and it's completely unfair to the ISOs and RTOs. So the states have to really pull together and do their work. They also, I have to say it, it's kind of painful to admit, we're short transmission planners. We have a lot of trouble finding people to do this kind of work. We're looking now to recruit from our community colleges and technical colleges, and then train them up, because we can't get them anywhere else. So we have challenges there, but you have to be committed to this, and it's a multi-year process to pull the states together.
Thank you. Zach, what planning activities can take place in advance of solving interregional transmission cost allocation?
Yeah, that's a loaded question, but a good one. Because if you saw me nodding along, I mean, cost allocation, I have experienced, many of us have experienced, I mean, that can stand in the way from even getting something started. If there's the threat of something getting allocated in a way that, depending on your perspective, may get allocated in an unfair way, you may not want to start even being part of the initiative. So I think it starts with doing some good technical analysis, and this is where I really give kudos to the Atlantic Offshore Wind Study and the efforts by DOE, NREL, and others. I'm not exaggerating. It really helped, and it really came at the perfect time here in the Northeast, at least. I mean, we were wrestling with that question already, and it may not have gone said, but it was in everyone's mind. What implications does this have down the road for cost allocation, and where do we go with it? It is really nice to have DOE, NREL, but with us in the room giving technical advice on the study, to really be pushing it along. And I think that really makes the biggest difference. But I will say you have to tackle it at some point, and you don't want to leave it till the end. I think that through that study work, then you start to think about, well, who is benefiting? And assuming that you are sticking with some version of a beneficiaries pay concept, then who are the beneficiaries? How far do you go in defining the beneficiaries? Also, I'll acknowledge, how far do you go beyond solely the concept of Atlantic offshore wind? Is there something more to it? Is it only the Atlantic offshore wind? If you were to do an offshore grid, as has been discussed today, is that as far as you go, or is there something more to that with the grid build out and the grid upgrades that you would need in order to accommodate those interconnections once you hit land? That's an open question, but it's something worth considering, and it's something that in my mind you would need to consider before figuring out exactly what the cost allocation is. And it's best to be thinking about that on the front end rather than waiting until the end to figure it out. So there's no silver bullet, not one that I've found, at least in my years of experience. But it's important to keep the thought of cost allocation on the table and to not hide from it, because it's going to rear its head at some point.
Yeah, and I can jump in and maybe just say a couple words on this question also. Zach, you made a great point about the offshore grid. How far south should it go? I think as we think about what can be done prior to interregional cost allocation, I think each of these state-federal partnerships will need to be done within a region first. And so when I think about how far should it extend in PJM, I'm thinking how far west, right? There are a lot of other states where if you take their needs into account, there might be net benefits for those states and a much lower cost overall to allow the offshore wind injections to take place and really be distributed system-wide. And so I think the regional collaborations that are outlined in the immediate recommendations are going to be really critical in the short term between the offshore wind states, like in PJM and New England, we have those 9 states. But then within the region, how many other states can come together to create a suite of facilities? And this was the other thing I wanted to mention, is that it seems like all of these plans should develop facilities that are net beneficial to every participating state, right? We wouldn't want to create a portfolio of facilities that provides one state benefits at the expense of another. And MISO's LRTP has worked really hard at this to provide a portfolio that when you look at net benefits across all of the states, you see substantial net benefits in every case. And so that is directly dependent on the design of the system that MISO works so hard at. And I think that type of effort should be replicated within the state-federal partnership that we're talking about here.
And let me build on Joe's point for a moment. There are other initiatives underway also with DOE and some of the labs. EIPC is acting as a technical advisor on the National Transmission Planning Study. And that certainly comes to mind, given some of Joe's comments, that when you're thinking about facilities, also it's not just a matter of transmission facilities, it's all the facilities. It's all of the different resource build-outs that are likely to happen over the next few decades. And what type of grid do we need to design across the entire US to accommodate all of those? And what's the most efficient solution to that? And it may not always be transmission. There might be some offsetting effects from some of those resources. So, I mean, it's important to take all of that into consideration. I think, that's where I see working hand in hand, not just this Atlantic offshore wind study, but also a number of the other initiatives ongoing by DOE, by EIPC, and a number of other organizations.
Great, thank you so much. This question is for Sam. How can we establish a workforce that is not limited to the activity in a single state or region?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. Do you want to know how you can establish a workforce that's not limited to the activities within a single state or region? So I think what they're trying to do is bring a workforce together that's more interregional as opposed to just within each state.
There is some efforts already doing that. The Smart Power Compact within the Mid-Atlantic between Maryland and Virginia and North Carolina singled out the sharing of, or at least the mapping and the sharing of educational resources available within all those states. And that was sort of as an idea of a counterbalance to New York and New Jersey, which were singular states that were big enough to build almost their entire workforce. But the heart of the question is right, which is if we assume that we're going to have workforce constraints, how are we ensuring that the people that we do train, and this is not just workforce, but this is suppliers too. How are we ensuring that that's all being shared across the offshore wind industry? There are practical hurdles to that. Ironically, some of it is that state employees kind of can only work in their states that they're employed in. But wider than that, a lot of these offshore wind developers, in signing PPAs or ORECs or whatever their financial agreements are encouraged to do work within singular states. Kind of coming up with creative ways of lowering that barrier a little bit, so states recognize economic development in other neighboring states, and sort of coming up with a model of sharing those benefits. Works on a workforce level, works on a supply chain level, works on a broader investment level, and creates a more durable ecosystem overall. DOE outside of this has also been doing a lot of important work measuring what the American workforce currently is and measuring what the workforce needed is. Within states, they're also doing that, but that broader national effort also just illuminates the areas that we need colleges to step up, community colleges to step up, and I'm going to say something I'm not sure that's true, but within the state and federal partnership, I do believe they definitely singled out supply chain coordination between the states as a priority. I believe that there was some thought given to workforce too. So if you're taking anything away from this entire webinar, it's state collaboration is needed to solve these problems. So building up a workforce, state collaboration between the states is definitely needed to share resources and share benefits.
Thank you.
I'd add to Sam's comments. I agree. The states have to sort of adult. They have to come up with something that's, not beggar their neighbor will it. So I just want to hoard this. Yeah, that's not going to work, and it's just going to make things terrible. So in New England in particular, we're the transmission planners, we're working with each other. Some states don't have any, so we're working to do a coordinated plan using the resources. I'll even say it's gotten so bad that I don't know if you can see the maps behind me, but the ones over this shoulder are actually Morocco, because I was sent there with USAID last month to work on their multi-terminal HVDC plan, which by the way is also 2,000 megawatts, 525 kV, because we are trying to coordinate efforts between states and federal government and NREL, and to use what resources we have to get the most benefits for everybody, even though we do not anticipate building out a transmission grid to join Morocco to the United States.
Great. I think we've got time for one last question, and this one is open to anybody here on the panel. Do you have any thoughts to offer on how tribal nations can engage with states ISOs, RTOs, and industry on offshore wind transmission planning efforts.
Yes. Connecticut has both state and federally recognized tribes. We actually have to meet with them. It's part of our Council on Environmental Standards. In addition, I noticed, I won't give out names, but there were two experiences in a certain New England state, Connecticut, 5 years, where Company A tried to build a land-based transmission project, which never got built. Company B reached out to the Native American tribe where the land project would go through. Initially brought them and made them parties with the whole project, and that project is getting built. So both for equity and environmental justice, and also for pragmatic reasons, early meeting, and we found it's best if the states and the states actually do a lot of the facilitating of the work between the developer and the Native American tribes, because states usually have fairly established communication systems. So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, just to speak for ISOs, RTOs, I can't speak in detail about each one of our members across the Eastern Interconnection, but I agree with Bob's answer. I mean, in my experience, I would expect through state agencies would be the most effective approach. But then at the same time, ISOs, RTOs, and other planning coordinators, we all have various requirements about openness and transparency and some level of a stakeholder process to get involved. So, check in with your local ISO RTO, depending on where you're located. And there may be opportunities to get involved directly there, but probably the most effective is through state agencies would be my guess.
All right, well, that concludes our Q&A portion today. Thank you so much. We did get a large number of questions coming in, which has been fantastic. So as I mentioned earlier, if we do not get to your question today, we will put together an FAQ. We'll answer the questions from today, and we'll share this with everyone who is registered when it's ready. So don't worry, we're not ignoring your questions. We just have a lot of information to put into this 4 hours. So we're keep the questions coming, please. One question did come in about the relationship between the form and the other opportunities for substantive comments on the recommendations. I want to note that we are trying to offer multiple ways for convenience for the audience to get your recommendations in. There is no preferred way to provide your feedback, so we're happy to take it in any form. So thank you to this panel today. We really, really appreciate it. Now I would like to introduce Dylan Reed, the Senior Advisor, External Affairs with the Grid Deployment Office at DOE, for some program updates from the Grid Deployment Office, also known as GDO. Dylan?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. We'll be covering some federal funding opportunities available through the Grid Deployment Office as a part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So we know at the Grid Deployment Office, we know that there's a lot of interest overall in the federal financing opportunities available for offshore wind. At GDO, we have on a transmission basis, have opportunities for commercial facilitation, financial assistance, and planning programs funded through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act that may be of interest to the offshore wind community and industry. For commercial facilitation, GDO administers the Transmission Facilitation Program, a $2.5 billion permanent revolving loan fund, and the Grid Innovation Program, which is a competitive financial assistance program funded at $5 billion for 5 years. For each of those programs, offshore wind is eligible to apply for those programs. As has been covered elsewhere, there's a lot of planning going on as a part of this effort and our coordination with others overall. Importantly, GDO grid and transmission programs do not directly finance new energy generation, which is inclusive of both offshore and onshore generation, but our grid and transmission funding does significantly support upgrades to transmission and distribution overall, which hopefully should lower the cost of energy infrastructure upgrades and new builds overall, which allows additional private and utility financing for generation projects altogether. Just a little bit more on some of these programs as well. The transmission facilitation program, which many individuals will probably familiar with, is a $2.5 billion revolving loan fund designed to provide support to overcome commercial hurdles in the development of large-scale new transmission lines, upgrading of existing, and connection of microgrids in Alaska, Hawaii, and territories. And we know that there's been a lot of interest for offshore transmission lines, which are eligible for that. And we expect, we issued our first RFP late last year, and the application deadline for the first round of that closed on February 1, and we'll be moving forward with that later this year. But we do know that there's significant interest in using that program overall for both offshore and onshore transmission projects overall. And then I saw on our previous panel there were some state voices on there that have expressed interest in the Grid Innovation Program as well, which is a $5 billion program and supports projects to use innovative approaches to transmission, storage, and distribution infrastructure to enhance grid resilience and reliability. Of that, states or other units of government are required to apply as a part of that. And we do know that there's been collaboration from folks from states to look at how to partner and apply for that program as a part of offshore transmission lines. And we are excited to work and move forward with folks as a part of that. But as a part of this, all of these initiatives are a part of DOE's broader Building a Better Grid initiative, which we are which really hosts the opportunity to better plan, finance, coordinate, and work with local, local governments overall, as well as coordinate within the federal government. And then lastly, making sure all of our research and development programs are supported under that to ensure that we are using all tools available to the federal government to better plan all grid and transmission investments all together on that. So that's a quick update on federal financing programs overall, and happy to take any questions on that, as I know there is quite a bit of information related to offshore wind.
Thank you, Dylan. I'm not seeing any questions at this moment, but when we do have them, I will be sure to share them with you. All right, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Now I would like to go ahead and introduce Jonathan Abebe. He's the Senior Advisor with the Loan Program Office at DOE for his remarks on building a bridge to bankability. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
All right, great. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you and see you. You look great.
Thank you very much. Yeah, if we can go to the next slide. So hopefully folks are familiar with the Loan Program Office, but if not, just a quick slide here to remind everyone what we do. So LPO within the DOE is really the commercial looking aspect of DOE, looking at kind of the last mile of getting projects on a market level to commercialization. So we really focus on what we call the bridge to bankability. So really focus on a few items with first commercial deployment, follow-on commercial deployment, commercial scale-up, and finally also helping inform the debt market in terms of how to deal with new technology that's coming to the market. So serving as kind of the precedent for commercial terms and conditions for new technology entering the U.S. market. If we go to the next slide, please. So within that, we have several programs that we run. And so one distinction from the previous speaker on GDO is there aren't specific timelines when applicants need to apply. This is an open solicitation, so folks can come in and apply to various one of these programs that we have. The thing to note is there's several ones there with regards to offshore that we think maybe the top four focus towards offshore, but we do have a dedicated business and development group that we can help work with applicants to help them guide through which specific program best applies for their specific project. Next slide, please. To give folks an idea in terms of the scale that we're talking about, currently we have 135 active applicants. This was as of February, so there's a few more coming in March. We'll update these at the end of the month. But in terms of the scale, to give you an idea, is over $124 billion, and offshore transmission is part of that, as shown in the diagram on the far right. But there is, through the program mentioned above, there is significant funding that was both through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law as well as the Inflation Reduction Act that came through that gave significant funding to LPO. On the next slide, please. I'll focus on some of the specific things that we see that could apply to offshore. The key thing to note is with LPO, really, we respond to the application that are submitted by the prospective applicants. So there isn't a specific technology that we necessarily advocate for or against, but with regards to offshore, these are some of the potential paths forward that we see the applicants can apply to LPO for. That could be on the manufacturing side, all aspects of, the offshore, whether it's, the HVDC cables, the actual turbine themselves, or anything to do with the foundations. We can also do project financing with regards to the actual offshore wind farms, or related to the transmission line, whether the subsea cable or some of the upgrades onshore that are associated to facilitate the offshore transmission. And finally, also the maritime vessel to help construct these offshore wind farms, as well as the cable associated with that. So there's a lot of information there, I know, but ultimately I think the key takeaway that we want folks to have is that there is a dedicated group within LPO that really focuses on guiding folks through these various applications and which ones they could potentially apply for. And if we go to the next slide, we have a general email that we encourage folks to apply for. There's a no-fee pre-application consultation that we can do to walk people over through the various programs we have and the funding that's available. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Now I would like to introduce Jim Bennett, the Senior Advisor at BOEM, for his presentation on the Outer Continental Shelf Renewable Energy. Jim, I can see you. Can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, 2 for 2. That's great. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be spending some time with you and let you know a little bit more about our program, where we are and where we're going. We are the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We are housed in the U.S. Department of the Interior, for those of you who aren't familiar. And we are the federal bureau that actually issues leases and rights of way on the Outer Continental Shelf. We have jurisdiction for leasing activities, energy leasing activities in the exclusive economic zone. So we are looking at pursuit of 20 gigawatts by 2030. And we have to address some of the transmission issues that we may or may not have authority or jurisdiction over specifically. But let me summarize where we are and what we are doing. If you could advance the slide, please. To let you know that we've conducted, since 2013, we've conducted 11 lease sales, and that has resulted now in 27 leases, and these are all on the East Coast, does not include the West Coast, the 5 leases recently auctioned on the West Coast. We've got 2 research leases, 15 site assessment plans approved, and a general activities plan approved for the Block Island project, which goes through federal waters to the mainland. The main thing that we're focusing on right now, of course, is construction and operations plans. We've had 18 of them submitted to BOEM, and 2 have been approved thus far, the South Fork and the Vineyard Wind projects up in southern New England. We have 10 currently under review, and we are also, we have another 6 that are submitted and are being reviewed for completeness, et cetera. We have an objective of getting 16 of these COPs approved through approval by 2025. This is a huge effort, since most of them will require a full NEPA process, environmental impact statement, 4 of which we've recently issued. And we have 4 areas under leasing consideration. We'll get to that in a minute, but what does all this mean? If you could advance the slide, please. And another click, and maybe one more. What it means is that with the leases up and down the East Coast, which, as you can see from the night sky picture, is an absolutely world-class market, as well as the fact that we have world-class wind resources. But thus far, we only have 1 project with steel in the water. That's off of Virginia. We have 2 more on the way and many more after that. if you could click one time, please. The point is that in order to reach our 30 by 30 goal, click again, please. In order to reach our, actually, I guess you're going to have to click about 15 times here. In order to reach our 30 by 30 goal, we're looking at many projects being deployed just amongst those, just within those 27 leases that we have issued. And even then, it's going to be a real challenge to get to 30 gigawatts by 2030. Not to mention the issues associated with other matters such as supply chain and a transmission, of course. And in addition to the projects on existing leases, next slide, please. We're also looking at additional leasing. The next one up would be the Gulf of Mexico, which is conventional. It's bottom-founded technology. But after that, we're looking at the deeper waters in the Central Atlantic in order to move forward with the industry. The process has begun out in Oregon, and even we're also working in the Gulf of Maine for a sale in the near future. And in both the case of the Central Atlantic and the Gulf of Maine, it will probably involve floating technology, which is a new arena for this area. Let us go to the next slide. You heard earlier from Josh Ganji of our office about these many recommendations we have. I'd like to summarize and just point out a couple of them. One is the possibility of federal routing. BOEM could be embracing a particular routing plan and doing studies to help support that routing to move the process forward. However, we don't have authority for the plan itself, and that's going to require, as Josh pointed out, quite a bit of coordination and partnerships, multi-state partnerships, regional partnerships with the JIPCs and RTOs, and also the recommendation for a transmission task force that BOEM could put together in order to get to the plan that we're all working on. And then one of the other recommendations that Josh pointed out is better regulatory guidance, better clarity on the part of the guidance that we issue and the regulations we issue for issues such as ownership and coordination on multiple use of transmission lines and data sharing. I want to leave you with one final thought, if you could go forward, please. And that's the fact that we have a modernization rule out there. Our program was identified through regulation in 2009. We have not had a major change to the regulatory regime since then. And we're doing that right now. And there's a Federal Register notice out there asking for input on everything in the program and under the regulations, from leasing and auctions to decommissioning. And that includes technical changes such as the development of buoys in lieu of met towers, to the establishment of safety management systems and certified verification agents, CVAs. So your input on that would certainly be appreciated. We've had it out since January. It closes at the end of the month. And that also includes questions about bidding credits for shared transmission solutions. So that's where we are. Those are the things that we're working on and how they may affect the transmission activity. And I guess I'm going to turn it back to you, Whitney. Thank you again for giving us the opportunity to speak.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jim. Well, this is bringing us to our closing remarks for today's workshop. We did have a couple questions come in for Dylan. So someone had asked, are TFP and GRIP programs mutually exclusive, or can you apply for both?
That is a good question. I would have to, so I don't give incorrect information, I would have to refer back to our FAQ on our website that talks about the ability to use multiple programs between that. And I just don't have the answer for that off the top of my head. But if you go on our website, I do know that our frequently asked questions page for those programs do answer those questions. And if you also email transmission@hq.eoe.gov, we also have someone monitoring that email address who can answer these questions too. And I have access to that email, so promise that you will get a quick response.
Great. And then I had one more question for you, and then we can go to our closing speaker. If a state did a bundled RFP for clean energy generation and transmission, would federal funding be available for the transmission portion of the project?
Can you ask that again? I just want to make sure I fully understand the question.
Absolutely. If a state did a bundled RFP for clean energy generation and transmission, would federal funding be available for the transmission portion of the project?
Gotcha. It does depend on the eligibility of the project, and we can't comment if this is about a project currently to an open funding opportunity. We can't comment on any application or project, but in general, federal funding can apply to portions of the project. It's just that the actual generation aspect of a project can't be funded under certain projects within GDO and how the bipartisan infrastructure law is crafted. It does prevent us within GDO programs from specifically funding the generation portion of those projects.
All right, thank you, Dylan. I appreciate it. We just had those couple of questions come in after your presentation, so we want to make sure we got them to you. So thank you so much for popping back on. So please join me in welcoming Maria Robinson, the Director of the Grid Deployment Office at DOE, to the stage.
Thank you so much, Whitney, and thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. If you made it this far in the day, you definitely deserve a big pat on the back from us or from yourselves. It's been a jam-packed event, and we can't thank you enough for joining us and providing your feedback on these incredibly important offshore grid topics. And we over here at the Department of Energy want to thank BOEM for your strong partnership across the entire portfolio of offshore wind transmission efforts. We really love working with you. Well, a lot of work and great engagement and coordination have gotten us to this point. We know there's so much more to do. As you've heard today, both the Department of Energy and the Department of Interior will refine and finalize the recommendations that were presented today regarding how to best develop, collaborate, and coordinate on offshore wind transmission along the Atlantic coast from Maine to South Carolina. And we aim to release the action plan for offshore wind transmission development in the United States Atlantic region this spring. So as the analysis for the Atlantic offshore wind transmission study continues to progress, we'll have some more specifics regarding the potential Atlantic offshore wind transmission build-out scenarios and target publication of that study by the end of this calendar year. We know there's a lot of active work happening at the tribal nation, regional, state, even local levels. And as we move forward, we will continue to keep apprised of that work and seek out ways that we can support enhanced collaboration and coordination amongst all these different entities, as well as provide technical analysis and use our convening power to bring everyone together on shared solutions. And as you've heard from here in the Grid Deployment Office, there's a lot of hard work going into getting the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act funds out the door and put to work to improve our entire transmission system across the overall country. So as Secretary Granholm said at the very beginning of the event, we all look forward to continuing to work with each and every one of you, and we certainly could not do any of this without you. So thank you again, Whitney. I'm going to pass it back over to you, and I think heading off, ending up with our friends over at BOEM.
Yes, thank you so much, Maria. Introduce Elizabeth Klein, the Director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management at DOI, for our final send-off.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I am Liz Klein, as mentioned, Director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. And this week, I'm actually celebrating my 2-month anniversary in this position at BOEM. I am honored to be a part of the team here. It really is an amazing group of people doing an enormous amount of work to help facilitate our nation's transition to clean energy sources. Just by way of introduction, while I'm new to BOEM, I'm not new to the Department of the Interior, having rejoined the department at the beginning of this administration, and also having served here during the Clinton and Obama administrations. So I know firsthand actually how challenging transmission issues can be. I also started my legal career working on transmission projects and spent time during the Obama administration on challenges associated with modernizing our nation's transmission infrastructure. All of which makes me very excited to hear how much progress has been made in this effort that you all have been focusing on today. I want to thank everyone who has joined us, not only today, but throughout this workshop series. Your time, energy, and effort has really been invaluable. I'd also like to thank Secretary Holland and Secretary Granholm for their support, and our colleagues at the Departments of Energy and the Interior, especially the amazing BOEM staff, for their hard work to convene these workshops. We all know that smart and robust energy transmission infrastructure is critical to the success of offshore wind. We are really proud of the tremendous amount of work that has been done to date to identify areas for offshore wind leasing and then to start getting projects approved. But we know that approving the wind farm alone is not enough. It's just one piece of an overall puzzle, and transmission infrastructure is a really key piece of that puzzle. And if you've joined us throughout this workshop series, you know that developing this infrastructure presents challenges that will require creativity and collaboration to solve. One of the primary purposes of this convening series was to get stakeholder feedback, so I want to acknowledge how incredibly thoughtful and substantial much of this feedback has been. Your insight has really helped inform the plan of action, and your input has been invaluable to the development of the recommendations report. So truly thank you for taking the time and effort. Based on all of that hard work and feedback, we really do feel well on our way to finding paths forward to address the transmission infrastructure challenges both in the near and long term. BOEM is excited to continue working with the Department of Energy to find the right answers for offshore wind transmission in the Atlantic. And we're certainly looking forward to taking the lessons we've learned, developing the Atlantic recommendations, and continuing this work in other offshore regions of the country. Because the nation's transition to clean energy is happening right now, and we are building the momentum to ensure that offshore wind is here to stay. So thank you again for being a part of this workshop series. I know that there have been some very important conversations, and I also know that they will not be the last. Thank you for all of your support, and we look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you to everyone for your contributions today and over the past year. DOE and BOEM welcome any further comments or feedback after today's event. Please use the email address that is in the chat now and it's on your screen to continue the conversation. Additionally, we encourage you to submit comments on the Atlantic offshore wind transmission recommendations. The form that we're going to link here in the chat again is open until 5 p.m. Pacific time today. So that's Pacific time. You got a little bit of time there. Additionally, a copy of today's presentation will be posted on the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission webpage by this Friday. And the recording of today's workshop will be available on that same page in about 2 weeks. We will also email you with that information. We will also email you when the FAQ is also ready for any questions that we did not get to today. Again, we want to thank you all, our speakers, our participants, everyone for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.